As the evening light fades over the distant mountains and the familiar sounds of battle grow quiet, we find ourselves at the edge of another world. Tonight, we journey not to the blood-soaked plains of Troy or the marble halls of mighty empires, but to a land where the very earth seems touched by divine hands. A place where massive stone pyramids pierce the desert sky like geometric mountains, where golden treasures sleep in tombs older than memory, and where kings were not merely rulers, but living gods who commanded the sacred waters of the greatest river on earth. This is the story of ancient Egypt, a civilization so magnificent and enduring that its monuments still inspire wonder 4,500 years after their creation. But this tale begins not with pharaohs and pyramids, not with golden masks or towering temples, but with something far simpler and more profound: the rhythm of water and the promise of black earth. Long before the first stone was cut for the Great Pyramid, before hieroglyphs decorated temple walls, before mummies rested in golden sarcophagi, there was only the Nile. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, for the rich dark soil that remained after the annual flood. Beyond lay the Deshret, the Red Land, an endless ocean of sand that stretched to the very edges of the world. Between these two realms, in that narrow ribbon of fertility that traced the river's path through the desert, humanity would create something unprecedented, a civilization that would endure for over 3,000 years. Picture, if you will, the world as it existed 7,000 years ago. No great cities dotted the landscape. No written language preserved human thoughts for posterity. No organized kingdoms commanded the loyalty of millions. Instead, small communities of farmers and fishermen gathered along the riverbanks, learning to read the moods of the great water that brought both life and destruction with clockwork precision. They painted simple images on pottery, boats carrying the dead to the afterlife, animals both real and mythical, dancers celebrating festivals whose names are lost to time. These humble beginnings contained within them the seeds of something extraordinary. The Nile was everything to these early people. It was their calendar, marking the seasons with its rise and fall. It was their highway, carrying boats laden with goods from the highlands of Africa to the Mediterranean shore. It was their lifeline, bringing the black earth that made agriculture possible in a land that might otherwise have been nothing but barren desert. Most importantly, it was their teacher, showing them that beneath the apparent chaos of flood and drought lay a deeper order, a cosmic rhythm that connected earth to heaven, mortal time to eternal truth. In these scattered villages, something remarkable was taking shape. The people were learning not just to survive, but to thrive. They were developing techniques for working copper into tools and jewelry. They were experimenting with ways to preserve their dead, driven by a growing conviction that death was not an ending, but a transformation. They were creating art that served not merely decorative purposes, but magical ones, images that would ensure the continued prosperity of their communities and the safe passage of their loved ones to whatever realm lay beyond the western horizon. As the centuries passed, these communities began to coalesce into larger units. In the south, where the Nile ran between high cliffs and granite outcroppings, chieftains emerged who wore the white crown and ruled from the ancient city of Hierakonpolis. In the north, where the great river spread into a vast delta before meeting the Mediterranean Sea, other rulers donned the red crown and held court in the bustling delta cities. Two kingdoms, two ways of understanding the world, but both children of the same sacred flow. The tension between these two realms would define Egyptian consciousness for millennia to come. Upper Egypt, the south, was more traditional, more conservative, more closely tied to the river's sources in the mysterious lands of Africa. Lower Egypt, the north, was more cosmopolitan, more open to influences from across the Mediterranean, more willing to embrace new ideas and technologies. Yet both shared fundamental beliefs about the nature of kingship, the importance of the afterlife, and the sacred duty to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. For perhaps 5 centuries, these two kingdoms existed in uneasy balance. Sometimes they traded peacefully, exchanging the gold and granite of the south for the papyrus and pottery of the north. Sometimes they warred, each seeking to extend its influence over the other. But always they remained separate, divided not just by geography, but by different approaches to the fundamental questions of how society should be organized and how the divine will should be interpreted. Then came the king, whose name echoes through history like thunder across water. Narmer, whom the Greeks would later call Menes, the unifier. Around 3100 BCE, this southern ruler launched a campaign that would change the world forever. We see him on his victory pallet, one of humanity's earliest historical documents, carved in stone to commemorate his triumph. There is Narmer in the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down his enemies. There is Narmer in the red crown of Lower Egypt, master of both lands. The unification was not merely political, it was cosmic. For in joining the two lands, Narmer became something unprecedented in human history. A divine king, a living god who embodied the harmony of opposites. This moment, when the two crowns were joined upon a single head, marks the true beginning of Egyptian civilization as we know it. At Memphis, where the two kingdoms met at the junction of valley and delta, Narmer established his capital. Here rose a city that would endure longer than Rome, longer than Babylon, longer than any other seat of power in the ancient world. Memphis became the heart of the realm, the place where north met south, where the administrative genius of the pharaohs first took shape. With unification came an explosion of human creativity and organizational power that seems almost miraculous. Within centuries of Narmer's conquest, the Egyptians had developed one of the world's first writing systems. Hieroglyphs, sacred carvings that could capture not just practical information, but poetry, prayer, and philosophy. They created a calendar based on the flood cycle and the movement of the stars, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 sacred days, when the gods themselves were said to have been born. The early pharaohs of the first and second dynasties established the template of divine kingship that would endure for millennia. They were not merely rulers, but cosmic forces, responsible for maintaining the balance between order and chaos, civilization and wilderness, life and death. When they died, they did not simply perish. They were transformed, joining the sun, god Ra, on his eternal journey across the sky. This understanding of kingship profoundly shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. The pharaoh was Horus, the falcon god, while he lived, and became Osiris, ruler of the dead, when he died. His every action was freighted with cosmic significance. His health affected the health of the land. His righteousness ensured the proper rise of the Nile. His wisdom kept the forces of chaos from overwhelming the ordered world that civilization had created. The tombs grew larger, more elaborate, reflecting not vanity, but profound religious conviction. At Saqqara, near Memphis, royal mastabas, bench-shaped monuments of mud, brick and stone, housed not just the king's body but everything he would need in the afterlife. Food, furniture, even servants who were sometimes buried alive to accompany their master into eternity. These early dynasties established the rhythms of Egyptian civilization, the annual flood that brought both renewal and anxiety, the careful recording of grain harvests and tax collections, the elaborate festivals that honored the gods and reinforced the pharaoh's sacred authority. The bureaucracy that would become legendary for its efficiency began to take shape. Scribes, trained in the complex art of hieroglyphic writing, formed the backbone of the state. They recorded everything: the height of the flood, the amount of grain in the royal storehouses, the names of officials and their duties. Egypt became perhaps the world's first truly literate civilization, where the written word carried the power of divine decree. Trade networks extended up the Nile into Nubia, bringing gold, ivory, and exotic animals to the royal court. Eastward, they reached into the Sinai Peninsula for turquoise and copper. Northward, across the Mediterranean, they established contact with the emerging civilizations of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Egypt was no isolated kingdom, but a confident power reaching out to touch the known world. The gods multiplied and organized themselves into a coherent pantheon. Ra, the sun god, supreme but distant. Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, patron of craftsmen. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. Hathor, the cow goddess of love and music. And overseeing all, the concept of Ma'at, not just a goddess, but a principle. The divine order that kept the universe functioning, that separated civilization from chaos, that made Egypt what it was. Religious festivals marked the year's passage. The Opet festival, when Amun travelled from Karnak to Luxor, would not emerge for centuries yet, but already the Egyptians understood that the gods needed to journey, to be seen, to interact with their worshippers. The Sed festival, where the pharaoh renewed his divine power, may have begun in these early centuries, a ritual death and rebirth that allowed rulers to reign for decades while remaining eternally young in cosmic terms. Art found its distinctive style early, the formal hieratic approach that would characterize Egyptian sculpture and painting for 3 millennia. Figures stood in eternal poses. Men with left foot forward, women with feet together, both facing forward while their heads turned in profile. This was not primitive technique, but sophisticated theology made visible. Egyptian art aimed not to capture a moment, but to ensure eternity. The concept of the afterlife, which would become central to Egyptian civilization, began to take its final form. Death was not ending, but transformation, not departure, but journey to a realm where the deserving could live forever in perfect happiness. The mummy, that most distinctive of all Egyptian images, emerged from these early experiments with preservation, the desperate, loving attempt to keep the body intact so that the soul might recognize it in the next world. In the royal workshops of Memphis, craftsmen perfected techniques that would endure for millennia. They learned to work gold into intricate jewelry, to carve ivory into delicate figurines, to shape stone with a precision that spoke of divine inspiration. The palette of Nama itself demonstrates this artistic mastery, every figure precisely carved, every symbol carefully placed, creating not just a record of victory, but a magical object that would ensure the king's triumph throughout eternity. The early pharaohs understood something profound about power. It must be both seen and felt, both earthly and cosmic. Jer, a king of the first dynasty, created elaborate funeral arrangements where hundreds of retainers were buried alongside him, their bodies arranged in neat rows around his tomb, like sleeping courtiers attending their master's eternal rest. These were not acts of cruelty, but expressions of cosmic order. In death, as in life, the pharaoh remained the center around which all else revolved. The Nile itself became codified, measured, predicted. Priests at Memphis began keeping careful records of the flood's height, noting which years brought prosperity and which brought famine. They discovered the river's secret rhythm, that it rose not according to the vagaries of weather, but in harmony with the stars themselves. When Sirius, the dog star, appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn, the flood would follow within days. Here was proof that heaven and earth moved in concert, that the gods themselves orchestrated the annual rebirth. Language itself became sacred. The hieroglyphs that began as simple pictograms, a bird for a bird, a house for a house, evolved into something far more sophisticated. A writing system that could capture not just objects, but ideas, sounds, abstract concepts. The scribes discovered that symbols could represent not just what they showed, but what they sounded like, and thus began the complex interplay of ideograms and phonograms that would make Egyptian writing both beautiful and bewilderingly complex. These early scribes, trained in schools attached to temples and palaces, became Egypt's memory keepers. They recorded not just the practical affairs of state, but the wisdom of the ages, instructions for proper conduct, hymns to the gods, stories of heroes and monsters. The instruction of Ptah-hotep, though written later, preserves wisdom that surely echoes back to these earliest literate generations. Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed. The tongue of a person is their sword, and effective speech is stronger than all fighting. In the villages along the Nile, life took on the rhythms that would persist for 3,000 years. Farmers learned to read the river's moods, to plant when the waters receded, to harvest before the next flood came. They developed the shaduf, the ingenious lever system that could lift water from the river to irrigate fields that lay beyond the flood's natural reach. They domesticated the sacred animals that would become central to religious practice. Cattle whose strength pulled the plough, cats who protected the grain stores from rats, dogs who guarded homes and accompanied hunters into the desert. The villages themselves reflected cosmic order. Houses faced north to catch the cooling breeze, their flat roofs serving as workspaces and sleeping areas during the hot months. Streets aligned with cardinal directions, as if the earth itself were a sacred diagram. Markets bustled with goods from across the known world. Cedarwood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from the mysterious lands far up the Nile, where dark-skinned people mined the metal from veins in granite hills. Religious practices multiplied and intertwined. The cow goddess Hathor, later so beloved throughout Egypt, may have emerged from these early farming communities where cattle meant survival. The falcon god Horus, patron of Pharaohs, surely grew from the awe that desert people felt, watching these magnificent predators soar above the valley. Local gods, protective spirits of particular places, gradually organized themselves into a coherent pantheon as political unification demanded religious unity. The royal tombs at Abydos tell their own story of evolving beliefs. The earliest are simple pit graves, distinguished from commoners' burials mainly by their size and the richness of their grave goods. But gradually they become more elaborate, lined with wood, then brick, then stone, divided into chambers for different purposes, surrounded by subsidiary burials of servants, pets, and precious objects. Each generation of tomb builders reached a little higher, dreamed a little grander, as if sensing that their constructions were rehearsals for something magnificent yet to come. The pharaoh's regalia crystallized into symbols that would endure unchanged for millennia. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt, proclaimed his dominion over both lands. The crook and flail, borrowed from shepherds and farmers, declared him guardian of his people. The false beard, tied on with ribbons, connected him to the gods, who were always depicted as bearded. The Uraeus cobra on his brow promised death to his enemies and protection to his subjects. Mystery cults began to emerge around certain deities. Osiris, the dying and resurrecting god who would become central to Egyptian religious practice, may already have had devotees in these early centuries. The myth that would later explain his death at the hands of his brother Set, his dismemberment and scattering across Egypt, and his resurrection through the love of his wife Isis, surely grew from older stories about the annual death and rebirth of vegetation, about the eternal struggle between order and chaos, fertility and sterility, life and death. Trade routes extended like arteries from the heartland. To the south, expeditions pushed up the Nile beyond the first cataract into Nubia, returning with gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals for the royal menagerie. To the northeast, caravans crossed the Sinai Peninsula to bring back turquoise from ancient mines and copper from Timna. To the north, ships sailed the Mediterranean, establishing the first contacts with the emerging civilizations of the Aegean and Anatolia. The bureaucracy that would become Egypt's most distinctive feature began to take shape. Officials with titles that would persist for millennia: Chief of the Royal Seal, Overseer of the Royal Treasury, High Priest of Ptah, established departments and procedures that brought order to an increasingly complex state. Provincial governors, responsible for tax collection and local administration, created the first version of the famous Egyptian administrative efficiency. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2700 BCE, Egyptian civilization had become recognizably itself. A unified kingdom stretching from the first cataract to the Mediterranean, ruled by divine pharaohs, sustained by the annual gift of the Nile, organized by an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy, protected by the cosmic order of Ma'at. But human ambition, once awakened, knows no bounds. The pharaohs who inherited this carefully ordered world would soon discover that stone and geometry, properly combined, could touch the imperishable stars themselves. The stage was set for the most ambitious building project in human history, a monument so magnificent that it would be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But that tale of the pyramid builders, of Imhotep's genius and Khufu's vision, of the Great Pyramid rising from the Giza Plateau like a geometric mountain crafted by the gods themselves, must wait for another telling. For now, as the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, we can rest in the knowledge that the foundations of one of humanity's greatest civilizations have been laid, that from these humble beginnings along the banks of the sacred river would emerge temples and tombs, art and literature, wisdom and beauty that would inspire wonder for thousands of years to come. The great river flows on, as it has for millions of years, carrying its gift of black earth to the waiting fields. In the villages along its banks, people sleep peacefully under the protection of their god-king, secure in the knowledge that Ma'at holds chaos at bay, that the sun will rise tomorrow, as it has since the beginning of time, that they are part of something larger and more enduring than any individual life. The age of the pyramids is about to dawn, but tonight, in these early centuries of Egyptian greatness, all is preparation, all is promise, all is the deep satisfaction of a people who have found their place in the cosmic order and know that they will endure. The morning sun rises blood red over the vast waters that separate the world of men from realms unknown. In the year 1345, or perhaps 1325, for even the gods themselves disagree on such matters, a wandering tribe beholds the sign that will change everything. An eagle, magnificent and terrible, perches upon a cactus growing from what was once a human heart. In its beak writhes a serpent, ancient symbol of Earth's power. The vision burns itself into their memory like fire into bronze. Here, the god of war has spoken. Here, they will build their city. But this is no ordinary founding. These are the Mexica, the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, who have wandered for generations across the harsh landscape of what we now call Mexico. They are not the first to claim this land, nor will they be the last. Yet something in their arrival carries the weight of destiny itself. The small island in Lake Texcoco seems an unlikely place for greatness, a marshy, inhospitable spot that no one else wants. But the Mexica see what others cannot. Potential, written in the very geography of the place. The lake that surrounds their chosen island will become their greatest asset, Its waters will feed the floating gardens that transform swampland into the most productive agricultural system the world has ever seen. Its channels will become highways for trade goods, flowing from every corner of their future empire. Its defensive properties will make their city nearly impregnable to conventional assault. Most importantly, its symbolic significance, water, the source of all life, will mark their capital as a sacred space blessed by the gods themselves. From this humble beginning on a muddy island, they will build Tenochtitlan. The name itself carries power, place of the stone cactus, commemorating forever the divine vision that led them here. But names, like cities, can grow beyond their origins. Within 2 centuries, Tenochtitlan will house nearly 300,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. Its pyramids will rival mountains in their magnificence. Its markets will overflow with goods from territories spanning half a continent. Its very existence will challenge everything Europeans think they know about civilization in the New World. The Mexica bring with them more than hope and determination. They carry the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who have learned to thrive in this landscape. They understand the rhythms of rain and drought, the cycles of planting and harvest that mean the difference between abundance and starvation. They know which plants heal and which kill, which stones make the finest blades, and which clays form the strongest vessels. Most crucially, they possess an understanding of warfare that will soon make them the most feared people in all of Mesoamerica. Yet they are not conquerors when they first arrive. They are refugees, outcasts who have been driven from place to place by more powerful neighbors. The other peoples around Lake Texcoco view them with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. These ragged newcomers seem to possess little beyond their strange religious convictions and their willingness to fight with desperate ferocity when cornered. Who could imagine that within a few generations, these same peoples will send tribute to Tenochtitlan as vassals of the mightiest empire ever created in the Americas? The transformation begins with the lake itself. The Mexica quickly discover that the marshy environment, while challenging, offers unique opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. They begin constructing chinampas, artificial islands built up from mud, vegetation, and human ingenuity. These floating gardens are marvels of agricultural engineering, capable of producing multiple crops per year in soil so rich it seems blessed by the gods themselves. Each chinampa is a rectangle of land roughly 30 meters long and 2 meters wide, separated from its neighbors by canals that allow canoes to navigate between them like streets in a city. The construction of these gardens requires tremendous communal effort and sophisticated knowledge of hydraulic engineering. The Mexica must understand water flow, soil composition, and plant biology to make their system work. They must coordinate the labor of hundreds of families and maintain the delicate balance between fresh water from springs and the slightly saline water of the lake itself. Success brings abundance beyond anything they have known before. Failure means starvation for the entire community. Under such pressure, innovation becomes not luxury, but necessity. As the chinampas multiply and expand, they create wealth that can support specialists, craftsmen who work obsidian into razor-sharp blades, artists who carve stone into objects of breathtaking beauty, priests who maintain the complex calendar that governs agricultural and religious cycles. The growing surplus also supports warriors, men whose only profession is the art of combat. These eagle and jaguar knights will become the backbone of future conquests, but for now, they serve mainly to protect the growing settlement from raiders and rivals. The religious life of early Tenochtitlan centers around Huitzilopochtli, the god who guided them to this place. But he is not alone in their pantheon. Tlaloc, the rain god, receives equal honor, for without his blessing the chinampas would wither and the city would die. The dual nature of their central temple, one pyramid supporting 2 shrines, one for each god, reflects this fundamental truth. war and rain. Human will and natural forces must work in harmony for civilization to flourish. The early decades are marked by careful diplomacy as much as agricultural innovation. The Mexica are surrounded by more powerful neighbors who could crush them if they united in opposition. Survival requires walking a careful line between submission and independence, offering service to stronger powers while gradually building the resources necessary for eventual autonomy. They serve as mercenaries in other people's wars, gaining military experience while avoiding the full burden of leadership. They trade their agricultural surplus for tools, weapons, and luxury goods, slowly accumulating the material foundations of power. The political situation around Lake Texcoco is complex and fluid. The Tepanecs, based in Azcapotzalco, are the dominant power, ruling through a combination of military might and diplomatic cunning. Under their overlordship live dozens of smaller city-states, each jealously guarding its independence while acknowledging Tepanec supremacy. Into this world, the Mexica must fit themselves, finding allies where they can and avoiding conflicts they cannot win. It is a delicate game that requires patience, wisdom, and the occasional display of strength to maintain credibility. Marriage alliances become crucial tools of diplomacy. Mexican nobles marry into established families from other cities, creating bonds of kinship that can be called upon in times of crisis. These unions also bring new knowledge and technologies to Tenochtitlan, as foreign wives and husbands introduce different techniques of craft production, agricultural management, and religious practice. Slowly but surely, the Mexica are weaving themselves into the fabric of regional politics, no longer outsiders looking in, but players in the great game of power. The city itself grows with each passing year. Simple reed huts give way to stone houses. Dirt paths become paved streets. The central plaza expands to accommodate larger ceremonies and markets. The first version of the Great Temple rises from the island's center, a modest structure that nevertheless proclaims the Mexica's growing confidence and ambition. Each level of the temple that will later tower over the city represents not just religious devotion, but political statement. We are here to stay, and we serve gods whose power grows with our own. Trade networks begin to extend beyond the immediate vicinity of the lake. Mexica merchants, protected by warriors and blessed by priests, venture into distant territories to exchange local products for exotic goods. They bring back feathers from tropical birds, shells from distant oceans, obsidian from volcanic regions, and cacao beans that serve as both luxury consumption and currency. Each successful expedition strengthens the city's economy, while providing intelligence about potential allies and enemies in the wider world. The military traditions that will later terrorize entire civilizations are taking shape during these early years. Young men undergo rigorous training in the use of traditional weapons. The obsidian-edged club called a macuahetl that can decapitate a horse with a single blow, the atlatl spear thrower that can drive a dart through armor, the bow that can place arrows with deadly precision at surprising distances. But they also learn the psychological aspects of warfare, the war cries that can break an enemy's nerve, the ceremonial preparation that transforms ordinary men into instruments of divine will, the ritual capture of prisoners that brings honor to warriors and offerings to the gods. Religious practices become increasingly elaborate as the city's wealth allows for more spectacular ceremonies. The calendar of festivals grows longer and more complex, marking not just agricultural cycles, but military victories, diplomatic achievements, and religious revelations. The ball game, played on specially constructed courts, becomes both sporting event and religious ritual, its outcome sometimes determining matters of life and death for participants and spectators alike. Human sacrifice always present in Mesoamerican religion, begins to take on the scale and sophistication that will later shock Spanish conquistadors. As the 14th century draws to a close, Tenochtitlan has transformed from refugee camp to thriving city-state. Its population approaches 50,000 souls. Its chinampas produce food for the inhabitants and surplus for trade. Its warriors have proven themselves in numerous conflicts. Its craftsmen create goods that are prized throughout the region. Its priests maintain religious traditions that connect the community to cosmic forces. Yet this is still only the beginning of their story. The true test of Mexica power will come with the crisis that engulfs the Tepanec Empire in the early 15th century. When the old order collapses, who will rise to take its place? The various city-states around Lake Texcoco all harbour ambitions for supremacy, but which possess the combination of military might, diplomatic skill, and divine favour necessary to forge a new empire. The Mexica, from their island stronghold, watch and wait and prepare. Their moment is coming, and when it arrives, they will be ready to seize it with both hands. The young men who train in Tenochtitlan's warrior schools cannot yet imagine that they will one day march through the gates of cities 1,000 miles away. That tribute will flow to their island capital from territories stretching from sea to sea. That their emperor will be acknowledged as the most powerful ruler in all of North America. They know only that their God has brought them to this place for a purpose, that their city grows stronger with each passing year, and that their destiny remains to be written in the blood of enemies and the glory of conquest. The eagle still perches on its cactus in the hearts of the people, and the serpent in its beak still writhes with the power of the earth itself. The vision that founded their city continues to guide their actions, and the gods who blessed their beginning will demand ever greater offerings as their empire expands. From this small island in a lake, they will reach out to touch the edges of the known world. The age of the Aztec Empire is about to begin. But first, they must survive the trials that await them. The 15th century will bring challenges that will test every aspect of their civilization, their military prowess, their diplomatic cunning, their religious convictions, and their ability to forge unity from diversity. Some of these challenges they will meet with triumph, others with tragedy. All of them will shape the empire that emerges from the crucible of conquest and expansion. The foundation has been laid, the stage is set, the players have taken their positions. Now, the great drama of Aztec imperial history can begin in earnest, and the world will never be the same. In the shadowed valleys between towering mountains, where the morning mist clings to ancient stones like memories of forgotten gods, a people emerged from the high plateau who would reshape the very meaning of power. Long before the Spanish conquistadors would set foot on these shores, before European diseases would ravage populations across 2 continents, an empire arose in the Andes that would dwarf the territorial extent of Rome at its height. This is the story of how a small kingdom centered around a sacred valley would grow to command the longest empire in human history, stretching over 2,500 miles from modern-day Colombia to Chile. The origins of this remarkable civilization trace back to the mists of legend and the whispered stories passed down through generations of mountain dwellers. According to their own sacred narratives, the first Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca, that sacred mirror reflecting the sky at an altitude where the air grows thin and the gods seem close enough to touch. Manco Capac, as he was known, carried with him a golden staff given by Inti, the sun god, with instructions to wander until the staff would sink completely into the earth. Only there would he establish the navel of the world, the center from which divine rule would emanate. The archaeological evidence tells a different but no less remarkable story of gradual migration and cultural synthesis. Around 1200 CE, various groups began settling in the valley of Cusco, that fertile depression nestled high in the Andes, where rivers converge and the soil proves rich enough to sustain permanent agriculture despite the challenging altitude. These early settlers were not the sophisticated empire builders they would become, but rather one of many competing ethnic groups vying for control over limited agricultural resources in a landscape that demanded innovation and cooperation for survival. The Kilki culture, as archaeologists term these early inhabitants of the Cusco region, laid the foundations upon which imperial greatness would eventually rise. They developed the terraced agriculture that would become synonymous with Andean civilization, carving stepped fields into impossibly steep mountainsides and creating microclimates that could support crops at altitudes where farming should have been impossible. They mastered the art of working with the massive stone blocks that littered the valley floor, learning to shape and fit them with a precision that would later astound Spanish chroniclers and continues to puzzle engineers today. But perhaps most importantly, these early peoples developed the social and religious concepts that would eventually justify and organize one of history's most efficient administrative states. The notion of aini, reciprocal labor obligation, meant that communities worked together on projects that benefited everyone, from building irrigation channels to constructing ceremonial centers. The concept of elu, extended kinship groups that formed the basic unit of social organization, created networks of mutual obligation and support that could be scaled up from the family level to encompass entire regions. The transformation from Highland Kingdom to continental empire began in earnest during the reign of the 9th Sapa Inca, Pachacuti, whose very name means he who remakes the world. Ascending to power around 1438 CE, Pachacuti inherited a kingdom under siege by the powerful Chanca Confederation, a rival group that had swept down from the northwest and seemed poised to overrun Cusco itself. According to the royal chronicles preserved by Spanish chroniclers, the aging Inca Viracocha and his chosen heir had fled the capital, leaving young Pachacuti to organize the defense of the sacred city. The battle that followed would become the foundational myth of imperial expansion. Pachacuti, according to legend, received divine assistance when the very stones of the battlefield transformed into warriors to fight alongside his forces. Whether through supernatural intervention or simply superior tactics and determination, the Chanca army was not merely defeated but utterly routed, with many of their warriors choosing to join the Inca forces rather than face destruction. This victory provided both the practical foundation and ideological justification for what would follow. A systematic campaign of expansion that would continue for nearly a century. But Pachacuti's true genius lay not in military conquest alone, but in his understanding that lasting empire required more than battlefield victories. He completely reorganized the administrative structure of the state, creating the systems that would eventually govern millions of people across dozens of ethnic groups and geographic regions. The decimal system of organization that he implemented divided the population into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 households, each with appointed officials responsible for tax collection, labor mobilization, and local administration. The Mite system of labor taxation that Pachacuti formalized represented perhaps the most sophisticated approach to public works in the pre-industrial world. Rather than collecting tribute in goods or precious metals, the Inca state claimed a portion of each household's labor time, which could then be directed toward massive infrastructure projects that benefited the entire empire. Roads were built and maintained, agricultural terraces constructed, ceremonial centers erected, and administrative buildings raised through this system of collective labor that transformed individual effort into imperial grandeur. The road system that emerged from these collective efforts defied every assumption about what was possible in pre-Columbian America. The Capac Ñan, or Royal Road, eventually stretched over 25,000 miles through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, Stone-paved highways crossed mountain passes at altitudes exceeding 16,000 feet, where the air is so thin that even acclimatized highlanders struggle with exertion. Suspension bridges woven from grass fibers spanned river gorges hundreds of feet deep, creating connections between regions that geography seemed determined to keep separate. These roads were not merely transportation routes, but arteries of empire that carried information, goods, and cultural influence to the furthest reaches of Inca territory. The Chasqui system of relay runners could carry messages from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 1,200 miles, in just 10 days through a network of rest stations, positioned at intervals that allowed each runner to sprint at maximum speed before passing the message to the next relay. This communication system was faster than anything Europe would achieve until the development of the telegraph in the 19th century. The administrative capital that Pachacuti rebuilt at Cusco reflected the cosmic order that the Inca believed should govern all human activity. The city was laid out in the shape of a puma, the sacred feline associated with earthly power, with the fortress of Sacsayhuaman forming the head and the confluence of rivers representing the tail. The central plaza, Huacaipata, served as the ceremonial heart where the most important religious festivals took place, and where representatives from throughout the empire would gather to participate in the rituals that renewed the cosmic order each year. The Temple of the Sun, Coricancha, stood as the most sacred space in the entire empire, its walls lined with sheets of gold that caught and reflected the light of Inti, the divine ancestor of the royal family. Here, the mummies of deceased emperors were maintained as if they were still living rulers, consulted on important decisions, and brought out for festivals, where they would be offered food and drink as honored guests. This practice of royal ancestor veneration created a unique form of government where the dead continued to own property and exercise influence through their living descendants and appointed caretakers. Pachacuti's son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, inherited not just a kingdom but a proven system for expansion that he would employ to extend Inca rule far beyond the traditional boundaries of highland civilization. His campaigns pushed the empire's borders north into modern-day Ecuador and south into Chile, incorporating coastal desert peoples, Amazon forest dwellers, and highland farmers into a single administrative system that respected local customs while demanding universal loyalty to the Sapa Inca. The incorporation of new territories followed a sophisticated pattern that combined military pressure with diplomatic incentives. Local leaders who submitted voluntarily were confirmed in their positions and incorporated into the imperial hierarchy, often with their sons taken to Cusco to be educated in Inca customs and serve as both students and hostages. Regions that resisted faced the full military might of professional armies equipped with bronze weapons, quilted cotton armor, and tactical discipline honed through constant campaigning. The Mitama system of population redistribution that developed during this expansion phase represented social engineering on a scale not attempted again until the modern era. Entire communities deemed unreliable were relocated to distant regions where they could be more easily supervised, while loyal populations were granted lands in newly conquered territories where they could serve as examples of proper Inca behavior and sources of local intelligence for imperial administrators. The genius of this system lay in its recognition that true control required not just military dominance, but cultural transformation. Displaced populations gradually adopted the language, customs, and religious practices of their new neighbors, while the presence of established Inca colonists provided models for successful integration into the imperial system. Within a generation or two, regions that had been foreign conquests became integral parts of the empire, their populations identifying as much with Cusco as with their original homelands. The agricultural innovations that supported this vast population were as impressive as the administrative systems that governed it. the Inca developed more varieties of potato than the rest of the world combined, with different cultivars adapted to specific altitudes, soil conditions, and climate patterns. Maize was grown at altitudes previously thought impossible through the creation of protected microclimates and specialized irrigation systems. Quinoa, that protein-rich grain now popular in health food stores worldwide, was cultivated in quantities sufficient to feed armies on campaign and sustain populations through harvest failures. The storage system that preserved and distributed these agricultural surpluses represented logistical planning of extraordinary sophistication. Kolkhas, stone warehouses with sophisticated ventilation systems, were positioned throughout the empire at strategic intervals that allowed for efficient redistribution of goods based on local needs and seasonal variations. These facilities could maintain dried foods in edible condition for years, creating a buffer against harvest failures that made famine virtually unknown within Inca territory. By the early 16th century, under the rule of Huayna Capac, the Inca Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent and administrative sophistication. From the capital at Cusco, a bureaucracy of remarkable efficiency governed somewhere between 6 and 12 million people across an area larger than the continental United States. The emperor himself was considered a divine being, the direct descendant of Inti, whose word was law, and whose person was so sacred that common people could not look directly upon him. The royal court that surrounded the Sapa Inca reflected the hierarchical complexity of a state that had grown from a single valley to encompass dozens of ethnic groups and geographic regions. Nobles from throughout the empire gathered in Cusco for ceremonies that reinforced their loyalty while displaying the wealth and diversity of imperial territory. The finest textiles worked in patterns that indicated the status and origin of their wearers, transformed courtly gatherings into visual representations of the empire's reach and sophistication. But even as the empire reached its zenith, the seeds of crisis were already germinating in decisions made with the best of intentions. Huayna Capac's choice to establish a second capital at Quito, closer to the northern frontiers where expansion continued, created a dangerous precedent for divided authority. When he died suddenly in 1527, likely from smallpox introduced by early European contact, the succession dispute that followed would tear the empire apart, just as it faced its greatest external threat. The civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa, the two primary claimants to imperial authority, raged for 5 years and devastated the administrative and military systems that had made Inca rule so effective. Brother fought against brother, with each claimant commanding loyal armies and regional administrators. The conflict consumed resources that had been carefully accumulated over generations, while creating resentments and divisions that weakened imperial unity precisely when external challenges demanded maximum cohesion. As Atahualpa's forces finally gained the upper hand in this fratricidal conflict, strange reports began reaching the imperial court. Bearded men with pale skin had appeared on the coast, riding on enormous animals and carrying weapons that could kill at great distances. They claimed to serve a powerful ruler from across the great waters and demanded audience with the Sapa Inca himself. The year was 1532, and Francisco Pizarro had arrived with 168 men to challenge an empire of millions. The confrontation that would reshape the history of 2 continents was about to begin. An empire that had grown from the shores of Lake Titicaca to span the length of South America, that had created administrative systems of unprecedented efficiency and agricultural innovations that fed millions, that had built roads and bridges across impossible terrain and created a communication network that connected distant provinces to the sacred center at Cusco, now faced its ultimate test. The meeting between 2 worlds, 2 ways of understanding power and divinity, 2 radically different approaches to organizing human society, would determine not just the fate of the Inca Empire, but the future of an entire hemisphere. But that confrontation, dramatic and decisive as it would prove to be, was still months in the future. For now, in the high valleys where the empire had been born, where ancient stones still held the wisdom of master builders, and where the wind carried the scent of terraced fields climbing toward the sky, the business of empire continued as it had for generations. The Chasqui runners still carried their messages along the royal roads. The Mitre workers still laboured on projects that would benefit communities they would never see. And the mummies of dead emperors still received offerings in temples that blazed with gold in honour of the sun. The empire that would soon face its greatest trial had grown from profound understanding of how human societies could be organised for mutual benefit across vast distances and diverse populations. The administrative genius, agricultural innovation, and engineering achievements of the Inca represented one of humanity's greatest experiments in creating order and prosperity through collective effort and shared purpose. As the sun set behind the peaks that surrounded Cusco, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the walls of the sacred temples, few could have imagined that this world of carefully maintained balance and cosmic harmony would soon be swept away by forces from beyond the great waters, leaving only stones and stories to testify to what had been accomplished in these valleys, where the gods once walked among men. The sacred waterway's great flood had finally returned to its banks, leaving behind the black soil that would nourish another season of abundance. But as the waters receded in what we now call the 14th century, before the Common Era, they revealed something troubling. The established order that had governed this ancient realm for over 2 millennia was beginning to crack like sun-baked clay. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom had built an empire that stretched from Nubia's golden mines to the cedar forests of Lebanon. Their armies had humbled the mightiest powers of the ancient world. Their monuments proclaimed divine authority to the very heavens themselves. Yet now, in the shadow of their greatest achievements, the seeds of transformation were already taking root. The reign of Amenhotep III had marked the golden age of this ancient civilization. For 38 years, tribute flowed into Thebes from across the known world. Diplomatic marriages bound together the great powers in an intricate web of alliance and obligation. The capital itself had become a wonder that drew visitors from every corner of the Mediterranean, its temples gleaming with gold, its palaces echoing with the languages of a dozen nations. But this very success carried within it the elements of revolutionary change. The vast wealth that poured into the royal treasury from conquered territories did more than simply enrich the ruling class. It transformed the fundamental nature of belief itself. How could traditional gods, bound to local temples and particular cities, adequately represent a pharaoh whose dominion encompassed the civilized world? How could ancient rituals, designed for the intimate scale of the Nile Valley, speak to the cosmic responsibilities of universal kingship? These questions found their most dramatic expression in the young prince who would ascend the throne as Amenhotep IV. Initially, his reign seemed to follow conventional patterns. He completed his father's building projects, maintained diplomatic relations with allied powers, and participated in the traditional religious ceremonies that had sanctified pharaonic rule for countless generations. The great temple complex at Karnak continued its ancient rhythms. The priests of Amun performed their daily rituals, and the cosmic order appeared as stable as the pyramids themselves. Yet beneath this surface tranquility, revolutionary forces were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The prince had been exposed from childhood to the cosmopolitan atmosphere of his father's court, where foreign ambassadors brought not only tribute and gifts, but ideas that challenged traditional assumptions about the nature of divinity itself. Solar worship, always important in royal ideology, began to take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of universal empire. If the pharaoh truly ruled all peoples under the sun, might not the sun itself be the only god worthy of such dominion? The transformation began subtly, almost imperceptibly. New artistic styles appeared in royal commissions, emphasizing the life-giving rays of the solar disk. Theological texts began exploring concepts of universal divine power that transcended local cult boundaries. Foreign diplomatic correspondence increasingly employed solar imagery to describe the pharaoh's international authority. These changes might have remained within the bounds of traditional religious development, representing merely another phase in the long evolution of a royal ideology. But the young pharaoh possessed a visionary temperament that could not be satisfied with gradual reform. Around the 5th year of his reign, he made a decision that would shatter 3 millennia of religious tradition. He changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. More shocking still, he proclaimed that the Aten, the solar disk, was not merely the supreme god among many, but the only true god in existence. All other deities were declared false. Their temples were to be closed, their images destroyed, their very names chiseled from monuments throughout the realm. This was not mere religious reform, but theological revolution of unprecedented scope. Never before in recorded history had a ruler attempted to impose monotheism upon an entire civilization through royal decree. The implications extended far beyond matters of cult and ceremony. The traditional priesthood, which had accumulated enormous wealth and political influence over centuries, found itself not merely displaced, but declared heretical. The administrative system, deeply intertwined with temple hierarchies, faced fundamental disruption. Local communities, whose identity centered on ancestral patron deities, confronted the systematic destruction of beliefs that had shaped their world since time immemorial. Akhenaten's revolution was not content with religious transformation alone. He abandoned Thebes, the traditional capital with its powerful priesthood of Amun, and established an entirely new city in Middle Egypt. This new capital, which he called Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, rose from virgin desert with unprecedented speed. Here, in temples open to the sky rather than shrouded in traditional mystery, the royal family worshipped the Aten in ceremonies that broke with every convention of pharaonic religious practice. The art commissioned for this new capital departed as dramatically from tradition as the theology it expressed. Gone were the formal, idealized representations that had characterized royal portraiture for millennia. Instead, Akhenaten appeared with elongated skull, feminine hips, and prominent belly, rendered in a style that emphasized humanity rather than divine perfection. Royal family scenes depicted intimate moments, the pharaoh kissing his wife, playing with his daughters, that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. This artistic revolution reflected the broader transformation of royal ideology. Where traditional pharaohs had been distant, godlike figures, Akhenaten presented himself as the loving father of his people, made human through his relationship with the universal father, the Aten. Yet for all its theological sophistication and artistic innovation, the Amarna revolution carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The systematic dismantling of traditional religious structures alienated not only the displaced priesthood, but vast segments of the population whose daily lives had been organized around ancient patterns of festival and observance. More fatally, Akhenaten's obsession with religious transformation distracted him from the practical business of imperial administration. The diplomatic correspondence discovered at Amarna reveals an empire in crisis as provincial governors pleaded for military assistance that never came. In Syria and Palestine, local rulers who had been loyal vassals for generations found themselves abandoned to face rising threats from Hittite expansion and nomadic raids. Their desperate letters to Akhenaten paint a picture of systematic imperial collapse. "The king, my lord, should know that ever since the archers returned to Egypt, Aziru has been taking the king's land for himself. Send archers so that the king's land does not get lost." But the pharaoh's attention remained fixed on theological matters, while the empire his fathers had built with blood and bronze crumbled away. The military consequences of this neglect extended beyond the loss of tribute and prestige. The imperial system had been more than a source of wealth. It had been a demonstration of divine favor that legitimized pharaonic rule. When subject peoples successfully rebelled against Egyptian authority, they called into question not merely the pharaoh's political competence, but his cosmic role as maintainer of universal order. The very theology that justified monotheistic revolution, the pharaoh as sole earthly representative of the universal God, was undermined by his apparent inability to maintain the earthly dominion that evidenced divine approval. Meanwhile, within Egypt itself, the economic disruption caused by religious revolution created hardships that traditional royal ideology could not explain. Temple estates that had employed thousands of workers were abandoned. Craft industries that had depended on religious commissions collapsed. Trade networks that had connected Egypt to the wider world contracted as diplomatic relationships deteriorated. The prosperity that had made the new kingdom the envy of the ancient world gave way to uncertainty and want. Perhaps most dangerously, the military establishment that had created and sustained the empire began to question the pharaoh's leadership. Professional soldiers who had spent their careers expanding Egyptian dominion watched helplessly as territories won through their sacrifice were lost through royal neglect. The officer corps, drawn largely from traditional noble families, found their own religious beliefs under attack, while their professional competence was ignored in favor of theological speculation. As Akhenaten's reign progressed, opposition crystallized around several key figures who would ultimately orchestrate the counter-revolution. Horemheb, the general who commanded what remained of the imperial army, maintained order in the military ranks while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with royal authority. A court official who may have been the pharaoh's father-in-law, preserved administrative continuity while positioning himself to influence whatever succession might emerge. Most importantly, there were members of the royal family itself who understood that the dynasty's survival required abandoning the very revolution that had defined it. The end came with characteristic drama when Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, possibly in his 17th regnal year. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious, whether from natural causes, assassination, or the accumulated stress of governing an empire in crisis. What is certain is that his passing created an immediate succession crisis that the revolutionary government was ill-equipped to handle. The systematic destruction of traditional political networks had left the regime dependent entirely on the pharaoh's personal charisma and theological vision. Without him, the entire revolutionary structure began to collapse with stunning rapidity. The succession initially fell to a shadowy figure known as Smenkhkare, who may have been Akhenaten's brother or even his eldest daughter, masquerading as a male ruler. This reign lasted only months before another transition brought to the throne a boy who would become the most famous pharaoh in history, though for reasons his contemporary supporters could never have anticipated. Tutankhaten, as he was initially known, was probably no more than 9 years old when he assumed power, making him a perfect figurehead for the restoration that powerful court factions had already begun planning. The counter-revolution unfolded with systematic thoroughness that matched the original religious revolution in scope and exceeded it in effectiveness. The boy pharaoh's name was changed from Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, to to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Amun, signaling the restoration of traditional religious authority. The heretical capital at Amarna was abandoned, its population relocated to Memphis and Thebes. The temples of the traditional gods were reopened, their damaged images restored, their displaced priesthoods reinstated with generous royal endowments that acknowledged the suffering they had endured. But the restoration was more than mere religious counter-revolution. It represented a fundamental reordering of the relationship between pharaonic authority and the institutions that sustained it. Where Akhenaten had sought to concentrate all power in his own person as sole intermediary with the divine, the Restoration government distributed authority among multiple centers of power. The traditional priesthood regained not only their religious functions, but significant political influence. The military establishment was granted greater autonomy in operational matters, while being bound to the dynasty through generous rewards and prestigious appointments. Provincial administrators were given clearer guidelines and better support, enabling them to begin the long process of restoring imperial control over rebellious territories. The young Tutankhamun himself became the symbol of this restored order, though real power rested with the advisors who governed in his name. Chief among these was I, who had survived the revolutionary period by avoiding direct confrontation with Akhenaten while positioning himself to lead the restoration. His careful political management ensured that the counter-revolution proceeded without the violence and disruption that might have further weakened the kingdom. Former supporters of the Amarna regime who submitted to the new order were pardoned and often retained in their positions, while only the most prominent revolutionary leaders faced punishment. The artistic and cultural restoration proved as systematic as the political and religious changes. The distinctive Amarna style was abandoned in favor of traditional forms that connected the new regime to the glorious precedents of earlier reigns. Royal portraiture returned to the idealized conventions that emphasized divine rather than human characteristics. Temple decorations once again depicted the pharaoh in ritual relationship with the traditional pantheon. Even the capital city of Amarna was systematically dismantled, its stone blocks carried away for use in restoration projects at Memphis and Thebes. Yet the restoration could not simply erase the revolutionary interlude as if it had never occurred. The Amarna period had demonstrated that traditional forms were not immutable, that religious authority could be challenged, that imperial power was not automatically self-sustaining. These lessons influenced the restored government's approach to administration and diplomacy. Greater attention was paid to provincial concerns, military commanders received more resources and autonomy, and foreign policy became more aggressive in reasserting Egyptian authority over rebellious territories. The brief reign of Tutankhamun, who died around 1323 BCE at approximately 19 years of age, marked the completion of the immediate restoration process. His tomb, discovered nearly intact by Howard Carter in 1922, revealed the extraordinary wealth that had been accumulated to demonstrate the renewed prosperity of traditional kingship. The golden burial mask that became the iconic image of ancient Egypt was more than artistic masterpiece. It was political statement proclaiming that the god-kings had returned in all their eternal splendor. With Tutankhamun's death, the succession passed to A, the architect of the restoration, who ruled briefly before being succeeded by Horemheb, the military commander who had maintained order throughout the revolutionary crisis. Horemheb's reign marked the final phase of the counter-revolution, as he systematically destroyed every trace of the Amarna experiment. Akhenaten's name was chiseled from monuments, his capital was razed, and official records were altered to erase any mention of the heretical period. The revolutionary pharaoh became a non-person, his existence denied by the very state he had sought to transform. But Horemheb's efforts to erase the revolutionary interlude could not eliminate its consequences. The empire that emerged from the restoration was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before Akhenaten's theological experiment. The traditional priesthood, having experienced the fragility of their position, became more politically active and demanding. The military establishment, having witnessed the consequences of imperial neglect, insisted on greater resources and authority. Provincial administrators, having seen the chaos that resulted from central government dysfunction, demanded clearer policies and better support. Most significantly, the restored empire faced a transformed international environment. The 2 decades of imperial weakness during and after the Amarna period had allowed rival powers to expand their influence at Egyptian expense. The Hittite Empire had conquered much of Syria, establishing a northern frontier that blocked Egyptian access to traditional spheres of influence. Local rulers throughout the Levant had learned that Egyptian protection could not be relied upon, leading them to develop alternative relationships that reduced their dependence on pharaonic authority. The Nubian territories, though still nominally Egyptian, had developed greater autonomy and were beginning to assert their own political and cultural identity. The challenge facing the post-Amarna pharaohs was therefore not simply restoration, but reconstruction. They needed to rebuild not only the domestic institutions that Akhenaten had disrupted, but also the international relationships that his neglect had damaged. This would require military campaigns to reassert imperial authority, diplomatic initiatives to restore alliance networks, and domestic reforms to ensure that future religious upheavals could not again threaten imperial stability. The task fell ultimately to a new dynasty, the 19th, established by Rameses III, a military commander chosen by Horemheb as his successor. This new royal house understood that legitimacy required not only religious orthodoxy, but demonstrated effectiveness in the practical business of governance. They would need to prove that traditional kingship could meet the challenges of a changed world, that the god-kings could once again command the respect and obedience that had made Egypt the greatest power of the ancient world. The stage was thus set for the final act of New Kingdom greatness, as the Ramessid pharaohs prepared to launch the military campaigns and construction projects that would either restore Egyptian dominance or exhaust the kingdom's remaining strength in the attempt. The revolution was over, but its consequences would shape the destiny of pharaonic civilization for centuries to come. The chaos of battle has finally settled over the plains of Troy, but as dust mingles with blood beneath the ancient walls, a different kind of warfare begins to unfold across the ocean. While Greek heroes sail home with their hard-won victories, another civilization rises from the misty waters and volcanic shores of what we now call Mexico. This is not a story of bronze and chariots, but of obsidian and prophecy, of floating gardens and human hearts offered to hungry gods. In the highlands of central Mexico, sometime around 1100 CE, a nomadic people known as the Mexica began one of history's most remarkable journeys. They called themselves the Children of Aztlan, the White Land, a mystical place somewhere in the northern deserts that lived more in legend than memory. Led by the visions of their tribal priests, and driven by the commands of their patron god Huitzilopochtli, the war god and lord of the sun, they embarked on a migration that would last over 2 centuries and end with the creation of one of the world's most magnificent empires. The Mexica were not the only people wandering these lands. The collapse of the great Toltec civilization at Tula had sent waves of migration rippling across central Mexico. Chichimec peoples, the sons of dogs as settled populations called them, moved south from the harsh northern territories in search of better lands and greater opportunities. Among these migrants, the Mexica were neither the most numerous nor the most powerful, but they possessed something that would prove more valuable than armies or gold: an unshakable faith in their destiny. Their patron deity had promised them a homeland, but not just any territory would suffice. Huitzilopochtli had spoken through his priests, delivering a prophecy that would guide their wanderings for generations. They would know their destined home when they saw an eagle perched upon a nopal cactus, grasping a serpent in its talons. This vision would mark the spot where they must build their city, the place where their God had ordained they would become masters of all they surveyed. The migration was no simple journey from point A to point B. For over 200 years, the Mexica established temporary settlements, learned from other cultures, fought when necessary, and always moved on when their priests declared that the promised sign had not yet appeared. They absorbed knowledge and customs from the peoples they encountered, mastering the arts of agriculture, warfare, and statecraft that would serve them well in the centuries to come. During these wandering years, they developed the military traditions that would make them feared across Mesoamerica. Every male was trained as a warrior from childhood, learning to use the macuahuitl, a wooden sword embedded with obsidian blades sharp enough to decapitate a horse. They perfected the art of capturing enemies alive, for their gods demanded the beating hearts of sacrificial victims, not merely the corpses of the slain. They created military orders like the Eagle Warriors and Jaguar Warriors, elite fighters who dressed as their totemic animals and struck terror into their enemies' hearts. The Mexica also refined their understanding of the cosmos and their place within it. They believed that the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before, and that they lived in the 5th sun, an age that would end in earthquakes and destruction unless the gods were properly nourished. This nourishment came in the form of human blood and hearts, offered in elaborate ceremonies that maintained the delicate balance between order and chaos. The sun itself, they believed, required daily sustenance to continue its journey across the sky and prevent the world from falling into eternal darkness. Their religious practices centered around a complex pantheon of deities, each governing different aspects of life and death. Huitzilopochtli ruled war and the sun, but he shared divine authority with Tlaloc, the rain god whose tears brought life to the crops, and Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who had given humanity the gifts of civilization. Coatlicue, the earth goddess, devoured the dead and gave birth to new life in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. These gods were not distant figures, but active participants in human affairs, requiring constant attention and offerings to maintain their favor. As the years passed and the Mexica continued their migration, they encountered increasingly sophisticated civilizations around the lakes of central Mexico. The Valley of Mexico was a marvel of engineering and agriculture, its interconnected lakes supporting large populations through innovative farming techniques. Chinampas, artificial islands built from mud and vegetation, created some of the most productive farmland in the world. Cities like Texcoco and Culhuacan commanded trade routes and tribute from dozens of smaller settlements. The Mexica served various masters during this period, sometimes as mercenaries, sometimes as vassals, always learning and adapting. They proved themselves fierce warriors and capable administrators, but they never forgot their divine mission. Their priests continued to watch for the promised sign, and their warriors continued to dream of the day when they would serve no master but their own. The moment of destiny arrived in 1325 CE, on a small, swampy island in Lake Texcoco. There, according to legend, the Mexica scouts saw the vision their ancestors had sought for over 2 centuries. An eagle perched on a nopal cactus, gripping a serpent in its beak. The location seemed inauspicious to outsiders. The island was small, marshy, and largely uninhabited because no one else wanted such unpromising land. But the Mexica recognized divine will when they saw it. They called their new city Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus, and set about transforming the unpromising island into something magnificent. Using techniques learned during their long migration, they began expanding the island's area through the construction of chinampas. These floating gardens, built from layers of mud, vegetation, and organic matter, not only provided farmland, but also served to drain and expand the island itself. The early years of Tenochtitlan were challenging. The Mexica were still vassals of Azcapotzalco, the dominant power in the region, and paid tribute to their Tepanec overlords. But they used this period of subordination wisely, learning the arts of statecraft while building their city's infrastructure and expanding their population through alliance and conquest. They established a complex system of canals that served as streets, enabling the movement of goods and people throughout the growing city by canoe. The transformation of the Mexica from wandering nomads to settled city dwellers required new forms of social organization. They developed a sophisticated system of calpulli, territorial units that combined residential areas with occupational specializations. Each calpulli maintained its own temple, school, and administrative structure, creating a network of local governance that supported the central authority while maintaining community identity. As Tenochtitlan grew, so did Mexica ambitions. Their warrior culture, honed during centuries of migration and conflict, made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies. They began to establish relationships with other cities around the lake, sometimes through marriage alliances, sometimes through displays of military prowess. The promise of their patron god seemed to be coming true. They were indeed becoming masters of all they surveyed. The city's architecture reflected both practical necessities and cosmic symbolism. At its heart rose the Templo Mayor, a massive pyramid temple dedicated to both Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. This twin temple represented the dual nature of Mexica power, the military might that conquered enemies, and the agricultural abundance that sustained the growing population. The pyramid's construction required enormous quantities of stone and labor, demonstrating the city's ability to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. Surrounding the Templo Mayor, the sacred precinct contained dozens of other temples, schools for priests and warriors, and the palace complexes of the ruling elite. The entire area was enclosed by a wall carved with serpent motifs, creating a sacred space that served as the spiritual and administrative heart of the growing empire. Here, priests performed the daily rituals that maintained cosmic order, while rulers received tribute from subject peoples and planned the military campaigns that would extend their dominion. The success of Tenochtitlan attracted migrants from across central Mexico. Skilled craftsmen came to work in the city's workshops, producing the elaborate featherwork, goldwork, and stone sculpture that demonstrated Mexica artistic achievement. Merchants established trading networks that reached from the northern deserts to the tropical coasts, bringing exotic goods and foreign influences that enriched the city's culture. Scholars and priests contributed to the development of complex calendar systems and ritual practices that regulated every aspect of daily life. But perhaps the most crucial development during these early years was the formation of the Triple Alliance in 1428. The Mexica joined with Texcoco and Tlacopan to overthrow their Tepanec overlords, creating a confederation that would dominate central Mexico for the next century. This alliance represented more than a military partnership. It was a sophisticated system of shared governance that allowed each member city to contribute its particular strengths while maintaining internal autonomy. Texcoco brought scholarly and artistic traditions, becoming the intellectual center of the alliance. Its ruler, Nezahualcoyotl, was renowned as both a wise lawgiver and a patron of the arts, creating legal codes and architectural projects that influenced the entire region. Tlacopan, though the smallest partner, controlled important trade routes and provided crucial military support. Tenochtitlan, as the dominant military power, gradually assumed leadership of the alliance while maintaining the fiction of equal partnership. The success of the Triple Alliance transformed the political landscape of Mesoamerica. No longer were the lake cities minor players paying tribute to distant overlords. they had become the overlords themselves, commanding tribute from territories stretching from coast to coast. The wealth that flowed into Tenochtitlan from this tribute system funded the massive construction projects that would make the city one of the wonders of the world. Under the leadership of rulers like Itzcoatl and Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, the Mexica developed the military and administrative systems that would enable their transformation from a regional power to a continental empire. They perfected the art of siege warfare, using massive armies to overwhelm enemy cities before offering the choice between submission and destruction. Those who submitted early retained their local rulers and customs while providing tribute and military support. Those who resisted faced the full fury of Mexica, military might, and the systematic destruction of their independence. The tribute system that emerged from these conquests was a marvel of administrative efficiency. Tribute collectors, backed by garrisons of Mexica warriors, regularly visited subject territories to collect the goods and services demanded by the imperial capital. These demands were carefully calculated, based on each region's productive capacity and specializations. Coastal areas provided tropical feathers and cacao beans. Mountain regions contributed precious stones and metals. Agricultural areas supplied the corn, beans, and other staples that fed the growing urban population. The wealth generated by this system enabled Tenochtitlan to support a population that may have reached 200,000 people at its peak, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The urban area covered approximately 13 square kilometers and was connected to the mainland by massive causeways that served as both transportation arteries and defensive barriers. These causeways included removable sections that could be destroyed in case of attack, turning the city into an island fortress protected by the lake itself. The engineering achievements required to sustain such a large urban population on an island in a lake were extraordinary. The Mexica constructed elaborate aqueduct systems that brought fresh water from springs on the mainland, ensuring that the city's inhabitants had access to clean drinking water despite being surrounded by the brackish waters of Lake Texcoco. They developed sophisticated waste management systems that recycled human waste as fertilizer for the chinampas while maintaining public health and sanitation. The city's markets became legendary for their size and diversity. The Great Market at Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister city, was said to accommodate 60,000 traders on busy days. Goods from across the empire and beyond could be found there: precious metals and stones from the mountains, tropical birds and their feathers from the coasts, cotton textiles dyed in brilliant colors, carved obsidian weapons and tools, medicinal herbs and exotic foods. Spanish conquistadors would later compare these markets favorably to anything they had seen in Europe. But the true foundation of Mexica power lay not in their markets or monuments, but in their military organization and warrior culture. Every male was expected to serve as a warrior, and social advancement depended largely on success in battle. The capture of enemy warriors for sacrifice was more highly valued than killing them outright, creating a complex battlefield dynamic where tactical skill mattered more than simple aggression. The Mexican military was organized into units based on the Calpulli system, with each neighborhood contributing warriors who fought alongside their neighbors and kinsmen. This created strong bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that made their armies remarkably cohesive and disciplined. Elite warrior societies like the Eagles and Jaguars provided specialized shock troops and military leadership, while also serving as stepping stones for social advancement. Military campaigns were carefully planned operations that combined religious ritual with practical logistics. Priests consulted the calendar to determine auspicious dates for beginning campaigns, while military engineers planned routes and supply arrangements. The army that marched out from Tenochtitlan was a complex organization that included not only warriors, but also priests to perform necessary rituals, merchants to establish trade relationships, and administrators to organize conquered territories. The religious dimensions of warfare were as important as the military ones. The Mexica believed that war was a cosmic necessity, a means of providing the gods with the sacrificial victims they required to maintain universal order. The flower wars, ritualized conflicts fought primarily to capture prisoners for sacrifice, represented the ultimate fusion of military and religious purposes. These campaigns were not intended to conquer territory, but to provide a steady supply of victims for the elaborate ceremonies that punctuated the Mexica ritual calendar. The practice of human sacrifice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was central to Mexica religious beliefs and political organization. They believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and humanity, and that humans owed a corresponding debt that could only be repaid through the offering of life itself. The heart, viewed as the seat of life and consciousness, was the most precious gift that could be offered to the divine powers that sustained the universe. These sacrificial ceremonies served multiple functions beyond their religious significance. They demonstrated the power and piety of the ruling elite, reinforced social hierarchies, and created powerful psychological effects that helped maintain order within the empire. The knowledge that rebellion would result not just in military defeat, but in having one's heart torn out atop a pyramid temple was a powerful deterrent to potential insurgents. The scale of these ceremonies could be enormous. The dedication of the expanded Templo Mayor in 1487 reportedly involved the sacrifice of thousands of prisoners captured in military campaigns specifically organized for that purpose. While these numbers may be exaggerated, there is no doubt that human sacrifice was practiced on a scale that impressed and horrified contemporary observers from other cultures. As the 15th century progressed, the Mexica Empire continued to expand under rulers like Axayacatl, Tizoc, and Ahuitzotl. Each conquest brought new wealth and new challenges. The empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups with their own languages, customs, and local loyalties. Managing this diversity required increasingly sophisticated administrative systems and a delicate balance between central control and local autonomy. The empire's expansion also brought it into contact with powerful enemies who refused to submit to Mexica authority. The Tlaxcalans, surrounded by imperial territory, but maintaining their independence through military skill and determination, became a constant thorn in the empire's side. The Tarascans of Michoacan possessed metallurgical skills that gave them superior weapons and successfully resisted multiple invasion attempts. These unconquered territories served as reminders that Mexica power, however impressive, was not unlimited. By the time Moctezuma Xocoyotzin ascended to the throne in 1502, the empire had reached a level of wealth and sophistication that dazzled visitors from across Mesoamerica. The capital city had become a marvel of urban planning and architectural achievement. Its pyramids rivaled those of ancient Egypt in their grandeur, while its gardens and palaces created spaces of beauty that seemed to belong more to paradise than to the earthly realm. The daily life of Tenochtitlan reflected the empire's prosperity and cultural sophistication. The city's schools trained young people in the skills necessary for a complex civilization. Reading and writing in the pictographic script that recorded imperial history and religious knowledge, mathematics and astronomy for calculating tribute and planning ceremonies, music and dance for entertaining the gods and celebrating imperial achievements. The Kalmakak, schools for the nobility, produced the priests, administrators, and military leaders who would govern the empire's vast territories. Markets throughout the city displayed the empire's wealth and diversity. Featherworkers created elaborate costumes that transformed human beings into living representations of gods and mythical creatures. Goldsmiths crafted jewelry and ornaments of extraordinary delicacy and beauty. Stone carvers produced massive sculptures that decorated temples and palaces with images of divine power and imperial authority. scribes recorded the tribute obligations of subject peoples and the ritual requirements of the elaborate ceremony calendar. The position of women in Mexican society was complex and varied according to social class and individual circumstances. Noble women could wield significant political influence, serving as regents for minor sons or negotiating marriage alliances between powerful families. Common women worked as merchants, artisans, and farmers, contributing essential labor to the empire's economy. All women participated in religious ceremonies, with some serving as priestesses in temples dedicated to female deities. The education of children reflected the military values that underpinned Mexican society. Boys learned to use weapons and participate in mock battles from an early age, while girls were trained in the domestic skills that would make them valuable wives and mothers. Both sexes learned the religious knowledge necessary to participate in the elaborate ceremonies that regulated community life. The harsh discipline of Mexican education was designed to produce adults capable of the self-sacrifice and devotion to duty that the empire required. The Mexican understanding of time was fundamentally different from European concepts of linear progression. They believed in cyclical time, where events repeated themselves according to divine patterns recorded in their complex calendar systems. The ritual calendar of 260 days intersected with the solar calendar of 365 days to create larger cycles that determined the proper timing for everything from planting crops to conducting military campaigns. This temporal framework gave meaning and structure to daily life, while reinforcing the authority of the priests who interpreted its requirements. The empire's agricultural foundation rested on the remarkable productivity of the Chinampa system. These artificial islands, built in the shallow waters of the lake, produced multiple crops per year and supported population densities that would not be matched in the region until the 20th century. The careful management of water levels, soil composition, and crop rotation required sophisticated knowledge of agricultural science and hydraulic engineering. The surplus production from these gardens fed not only the urban population, but also supported the large numbers of priests, warriors, and administrators who served the imperial state. Trade networks radiating out from Tenochtitlan connected the empire to regions far beyond its political boundaries. Merchants called Pochteca traveled vast distances to acquire the luxury goods that demonstrated imperial wealth and divine favor. These merchant ambassadors often served as spies and diplomats, gathering intelligence about potential targets for conquest, while establishing the commercial relationships that preceded political control. Their journeys took them to the Maya cities of the south, the desert communities of the north, and the coastal regions where precious shells and rare feathers could be obtained. The religious calendar that governed imperial life was punctuated by festivals that combined celebration with solemnity, joy with terror. The festival of Xuchmolpilli, the new fire ceremony held every 52 years, involved the extinguishing of all fires throughout the empire and their rekindling from a sacred flame lit on the chest of a sacrificial victim. This ceremony marked the end of one temporal cycle and the beginning of another, symbolically renewing the world and ensuring its continued existence. But beneath the surface, prosperity and magnificent ceremonies, the empire faced growing challenges that would prove to be its undoing. The constant demand for sacrificial victims required ever more military campaigns, straining resources, and creating enemies throughout Mesoamerica. The rigid social hierarchy that maintained order also limited social mobility and created resentment among those excluded from the benefits of imperial success. Most ominously, the empire's expansion had reached its natural limits, bounded by unconquerable enemies and the vast oceans that surrounded the continent. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in 1519 would expose these underlying weaknesses and bring the Mexican Empire to a catastrophic end. But the story of their rise from wandering nomads to masters of a continental empire remains one of history's most remarkable achievements. In less than 2 centuries, they had transformed themselves from refugees seeking a homeland into the rulers of one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. The legacy of the Mexica would outlive their political independence. Their agricultural techniques, architectural achievements, and artistic traditions would influence subsequent cultures for centuries to come. The city they built on a swampy island would become Mexico City, one of the world's largest urban centers. The eagle perched on a cactus, grasping a serpent, would become the symbol of the Mexican nation, connecting the modern state to its pre-Columbian heritage. Most importantly, the Mexica demonstrated that human ingenuity and determination could overcome even the most unpromising circumstances. Their transformation of a marshy island into one of the world's great cities showed what could be accomplished when vision was combined with practical skill and unwavering dedication. Their story reminds us that civilizations are not built by destiny alone, but by the daily choices of countless individuals who choose to work together toward a common goal. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine the sound of drums echoing across Lake Texcoco, calling the faithful to prayer in the temples of Tenochtitlan. We might picture the morning mist rising from the Chinampas, where farmers tend their floating gardens, or the evening light painting the pyramids gold as the sun sets behind the mountains. The Mexica believed that the world would end in earthquakes and destruction, but they also believed that new worlds would be born from the ruins of the old. Their empire may have fallen, but their story continues to inspire us with its vision of what human beings can accomplish when they dare to dream of greatness and work together to make those dreams reality. As you drift into slumber tonight, let me tell you the story of the Aztec Empire, a tale that spans centuries and weaves together divine visions, human sacrifice, and the rise and fall of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Our story begins not with the glory of Tenochtitlan, but in the harsh northern deserts of Mexico, where a wandering people called the Mexica searched for their promised land. These nomadic tribes had left their mythical homeland of Aztlan sometime in the 12th century, carrying with them nothing but their faith in their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, and a prophecy that would guide their destiny. For over 2 centuries, the Mexica wandered the central plateau of Mexico, moving from place to place, never welcomed, always searching. They were a people without a home, looked down upon by the settled civilizations they encountered. The established city-states of the Valley of Mexico saw them as barbarians, uncivilized nomads who had no place among the sophisticated cultures that had flourished in these lands for generations. But the Mexica carried within them a vision that sustained them through their long journey. Their god Huitzilopochtli had promised them a sign that would mark the location of their destined home. They would know the place when they saw an eagle perched atop a nopal cactus, gripping a serpent in its beak. This image, born from prophecy, would one day become the symbol of a nation. The wandering finally ended in 1325, when Mexica priests reported seeing the prophetic vision on a small swampy island in Lake Texcoco. Here, in what seemed like the most unlikely place, they would build their capital. The island was marshy, difficult to reach, and appeared to offer little in the way of natural advantages. But the Mexica understood that this was their divine destiny, and they set about transforming this unpromising plot of land into something extraordinary. They called their new city Tenochtitlan, meaning place of the prickly pear cactus, in honor of the sacred vision that had brought them here. What began as a humble settlement of reed huts and small temples would, over the next 2 centuries, grow into the largest city in the Americas and one of the most magnificent urban centers in the world. The early years were harsh. The Mexica were still regarded as outsiders by the powerful city-states that surrounded Lake Texcoco. They survived by serving as mercenaries for more established rulers, their warriors earning a reputation for fierce courage and military skill. They learned the arts of warfare, politics, and administration from their neighbors, all while maintaining their own distinct identity and religious practices. The transformation from wandering tribe to imperial power began in earnest in 1428, when the Mexica formed what would become known as the Triple Alliance. They joined forces with the city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan to overthrow the Tepanec Empire, which had dominated the Valley of Mexico for decades. This alliance would prove to be the foundation of Aztec imperial expansion. Under the leadership of their fourth ruler, Itzcoatl, the Mexica began to assert their dominance over neighboring territories. But it was under his successor, Moctezuma Iluikamina, that the empire truly began to take shape. This first Moctezuma, often called Moctezuma the Elder to distinguish him from his more famous descendant, ruled for nearly 3 decades and established many of the institutions that would define Aztec civilization. The empire that emerged was unlike the European kingdoms that Spanish conquistadors knew. Rather than direct territorial control, the Aztecs preferred a system of tribute and vassalage. Conquered cities were allowed to maintain their own rulers and customs as long as they paid tribute to Tenochtitlan and acknowledged Aztec supremacy. This system proved remarkably effective, allowing the empire to expand rapidly while avoiding the administrative burden of governing diverse populations directly. At the heart of this expanding empire lay Tenochtitlan itself, a city that grew more magnificent with each passing decade. The Aztecs proved to be master engineers, transforming their island home through a series of remarkable innovations. They developed the chinampas, often called floating gardens, which were actually artificial islands created by piling mud and vegetation onto the shallow lake bed. These agricultural plots were incredibly productive, capable of supporting the large population that would eventually call Tenochtitlan home. The city was connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, each wide enough for several people to walk abreast. These causeways included removable bridges that could be destroyed in case of attack, turning the city into an impregnable island fortress. Fresh water was brought to the city through an ingenious aqueduct system that channeled spring water from the hills surrounding the lake. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1519, Tenochtitlan housed between 200,000 and 300,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The city was laid out on a grid pattern, with canals serving as streets that allowed canoes to transport goods and people throughout the urban area. At the center of the city stood the sacred precinct, a walled compound containing the most important temples and religious buildings. The crown jewel of the sacred precinct was the Templo Mayor, the great temple that dominated the city's skyline. This massive pyramid rose in 7 distinct levels, each built on top of the previous structure as successive rulers sought to honor the gods and demonstrate their own power. At its summit stood twin temples dedicated to the 2 most important deities in the Aztec pantheon, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the ancient rain god, whose favor was essential for agricultural success. Religion permeated every aspect of Aztec life, and it was a religion that demanded blood. The Aztecs believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and humanity, and that humans owed a debt of blood to maintain the cosmic order. The sun needed nourishment to continue its daily journey across the sky, and that nourishment came in the form of human hearts and blood offered in sacrifice. These rituals, shocking to European sensibilities, were central to Aztec understanding of their place in the universe. They saw themselves as partners with the gods in maintaining the delicate balance that kept the world functioning. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial altar were believed to join the sun god in his daily journey, while women who died in childbirth were honored as warriors who had fallen in the battle to bring new life into the world. The empire reached its zenith under two remarkable rulers, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known as Moctezuma So, and his predecessor Ahuitzotl. Under their leadership, Aztec armies marched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, bringing ever more territories under imperial control. The wealth that flowed into Tenochtitlan from tribute payments was staggering. Conquered provinces sent gold, jade, feathers, cacao, cotton, and countless other precious goods to the capital. The emperor himself lived in a palace complex that covered several acres and housed thousands of servants, guards, and administrators. European observers who saw it described halls that could hold thousands of people, gardens filled with exotic plants and animals, and aviaries containing birds from every corner of the empire. The emperor's court was a center of learning and artistic achievement, where poets, musicians, and scholars gathered to create works that celebrated the glory of the empire. Aztec society was highly stratified, with the emperor at the top, followed by the nobility, then commoners, and finally slaves. But it was also a society that offered opportunities for advancement through military service. Young men who distinguished themselves in battle could rise through the ranks of the warrior orders, gaining wealth, status, and the right to wear distinctive costumes and ornaments that marked their achievements. Education was highly valued, with schools for both nobles and commoners. The Kalmakak, schools for the nobility, provided intensive education in writing, astronomy, theology, and statecraft. The Telpok Kali, schools for commoners, focused on military training and basic education. Both types of schools emphasized discipline, self-sacrifice, and service to the state. Women in Aztec society had important roles, though they were different from those of men. Noble women could become priestesses or play important roles in religious ceremonies. All women were expected to master the arts of weaving and cooking, skills that were considered essential to maintaining household harmony and religious observance. Some women even became successful merchants, traveling to distant markets to trade in luxury goods. The Aztec calendar was one of their most sophisticated achievements, actually consisting of two interlocking systems. The ritual calendar had 260 days and was used for religious ceremonies and divination. The solar calendar had 365 days and tracked the agricultural year. These two calendars meshed together in a 52-year cycle, at the end of which the Aztecs celebrated the new fire ceremony, a time of renewal when all fires were extinguished and relit from a sacred flame. Trade was the lifeblood of the empire, with merchants called Pochteca traveling vast distances to bring exotic goods to the markets of Tenochtitlan. These merchants were more than simple traders. They often served as spies and diplomats, gathering intelligence about distant lands and peoples. The great market of Tlatelolco, adjacent to Tenochtitlan, was described by Spanish observers as larger and more varied than any market in Europe. But even as the empire reached new heights of power and prosperity, seeds of its destruction were already being sown. The system of tribute and vassalage that had enabled rapid expansion also created resentment among subject peoples. Many communities lived under Aztec rule unwillingly, paying heavy tributes and providing warriors for imperial armies. The constant demand for sacrificial victims created a climate of fear and hatred that Aztec enemies would eventually exploit. The empire's military success had also bred a dangerous overconfidence. For generations, Aztec armies had seemed invincible, defeating all who opposed them. This created a sense of divine destiny that made it difficult for Aztec leaders to imagine that their empire could ever face serious threats. They had developed effective strategies for dealing with traditional enemies, armed with obsidian-tipped weapons and fighting according to familiar patterns. But they were unprepared for the radically different challenge that would soon arrive from across the Atlantic. Religious beliefs, too, created vulnerabilities. The Aztecs believed in cyclical time, with the current era destined to end in destruction, just as previous eras had ended. Prophecies spoke of the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who would reclaim his rightful place as ruler. When strange men with pale skin and horses arrived from the east, some Aztecs wondered if these might be the prophesied returning gods. The man who would exploit these vulnerabilities was Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador who landed on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with a small force of roughly 600 men. Cortés was ambitious, ruthless, and blessed with a remarkable ability to understand and manipulate the political situation he encountered. He quickly recognized that the Aztec Empire, for all its apparent strength, was built on a foundation of fear and resentment that could be turned against it. Cortés began by allying himself with the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs who had successfully resisted imperial conquest. The Tlaxcalans provided him with thousands of warriors and invaluable knowledge about Aztec society and military tactics. Other subject peoples soon joined this growing coalition, seeing an opportunity to throw off the Aztec yoke. The psychological impact of Spanish technology and tactics was enormous. Horses, unknown in the Americas, seemed like mythical beasts to people who had never seen them. Steel weapons and armor proved superior to traditional obsidian and cotton protection. Most devastating of all were the diseases that the Spanish unknowingly brought with them. Smallpox, typhus, and other European diseases swept through the indigenous population, killing millions who had no immunity to these foreign pathogens. When Cortés and his allies finally reached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, they were received as guests by Moctezuma II, who was still uncertain about the nature and intentions of these strange visitors. The emperor's decision to welcome the Spanish into his capital would prove to be a fatal mistake. Once inside the city, Cortés took Moctezuma prisoner, effectively paralyzing the imperial government. The final siege of Tenochtitlan began in 1521 and lasted for several months. The Spanish and their indigenous allies surrounded the city, cutting off food and water supplies while systematically destroying the causeways and buildings. The Aztec defenders, led by the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc after Moctezuma's death, fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed by disease, starvation, and the superior technology of their enemies. When Tenochtitlan finally fell on August 13th, 1521, it marked the end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spanish colonial rule in Mexico. The great city that had taken 2 centuries to build was largely destroyed in the siege, its temples pulled down and its palaces burned. In its place, the Spanish would build Mexico City, the capital of New Spain. The fall of the Aztec Empire was one of the most dramatic and consequential events in human history. A civilization that had dominated central Mexico for centuries was brought to its knees in just 2 years by a handful of foreign invaders. The Spanish conquest had profound implications not just for Mexico, but for the entire course of world history. Yet the legacy of the Aztecs did not disappear entirely. The indigenous population, though devastated by disease and conquest, survived and adapted to colonial rule. Many aspects of Aztec culture, from agricultural techniques to artistic traditions, persisted under Spanish dominion. The Nahuatl language, spoken by the Aztecs, continued to be used by millions of people and contributed hundreds of words to Spanish and eventually to English. The Chinampas that had fed Tenochtitlan continued to be cultivated for centuries after the conquest. The calendar system influenced colonial timekeeping. Religious beliefs blended with Christianity to create new forms of worship that combined indigenous and European elements. The very layout of Mexico City followed the grid pattern of the Aztec capital, and many modern streets trace the paths of ancient canals. In the realm of ideas, the Aztec Empire challenged European assumptions about civilization and governance. Spanish observers were forced to acknowledge that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had created complex societies with sophisticated institutions. This recognition, however grudging, contributed to evolving concepts of human nature and cultural diversity. The story of the Aztecs also became central to Mexican national identity. As Mexico sought independence from Spain and later struggled to define itself as a modern nation, the Aztec past provided a source of pride and distinctiveness. The eagle and serpent from the founding vision of Tenochtitlan became the symbol on the Mexican flag, linking the modern nation to its pre-Columbian heritage. Archaeological discoveries in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed the true magnificence of Aztec civilization to the modern world. The excavation of the Templo Mayor in Mexico City uncovered a treasure trove of artifacts that demonstrated the artistic and technological achievements of Aztec craftsmen. Museums around the world now display Aztec artifacts that speak to the sophistication and creativity of this remarkable civilization. The Aztec Empire represents one of humanity's great experiments in creating complex society. In the space of 2 centuries, a wandering tribe transformed itself into the rulers of an empire that stretched from sea to sea. They created a capital city that rivaled any in the world, developed sophisticated systems of agriculture and trade, and built monuments that still inspire awe today. Their story is also a reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest civilizations. The Aztec Empire seemed invincible at its height, yet it fell with startling rapidity when faced with new challenges it could not comprehend or counter. The encounter between the Aztecs and Spanish was a collision between 2 worlds, each with its own understanding of reality, and the consequences of that collision continue to shape our world today. As you drift deeper into sleep, consider the remarkable journey of the Mexica people. From wandering nomads to imperial rulers, from a vision of an eagle on a cactus to the reality of a great city rising from a lake. Their story reminds us that human societies are capable of extraordinary transformation, that seemingly impossible dreams can become reality through determination and faith, and that even the greatest achievements of human civilization are temporary chapters in the longer story of our species. The Aztec Empire may have fallen 5 centuries ago, but its legacy continues in the millions of people who can trace their ancestry to those who built Tenochtitlan, in the cultural traditions that blend indigenous and European elements, and in the ongoing human quest to create societies that honor both earthly achievements and spiritual aspirations. In the end, the Aztecs succeeded in their greatest goal. They achieved a form of immortality, not through the blood sacrifices they offered to their gods, but through the memories and inspirations they left for future generations to discover and cherish. Sleep well, and let the dreams of ancient Mexico carry you through the night, where eagle and serpent dance eternal in the realm of human imagination. As the great river carved its ancient path through endless sands, the people who would become masters of stone and time began to stir. The annual flood brought more than fertile soil. It brought the rhythm of eternity itself, teaching these early dwellers that life, death, and rebirth were woven into the very fabric of existence. In the sacred valley where the black earth met the red desert, a civilization was taking shape that would outlast empires, survive the rise and fall of distant kingdoms, and leave monuments that still pierce the sky after 4.5 millennia. This was not merely the birth of a nation, but the dawn of humanity's first encounter with the divine, made manifest in stone. The Aztec Empire had shown the world what could be achieved when mortal ambition reached toward the heavens, when warriors and priests united under the banner of cosmic purpose. But as their great city fell to Spanish steel and foreign disease, Another story was already ancient beyond measure, a tale of god-kings who built their tombs as stairways to the stars, of a people who turned the challenge of desert and flood into the foundation of immortal greatness. This is the story of a land where pharaohs ruled as living gods, where the dead were preserved for eternity, and where the greatest architectural achievements in human history rose from the genius of a people who understood that true power lay not in conquest alone, but in harmony with the eternal forces that governed both earth and sky. From the first unification of the two lands to the final breath of the last pharaoh, this is the entire story of ancient Egypt. A civilization that measured time not in years, but in dynasties, and built not for the moment, but for forever. The sun god Ra had begun his eternal journey across the heavens, and in the valley below, a people were learning to join him in his golden boat, to become immortal through stone, through ritual, through the sacred mathematics of the pyramid builders. The Black Land was about to teach the world what it meant to be truly eternal. In the beginning, there was only the primordial waters of none, the endless ocean of chaos from which all creation would emerge. From these dark depths rose the first mound of earth, and upon it stood Atum, the self-created god who would speak existence into being. But this was more than myth. It was the foundational story of a people who saw in their own landscape the very blueprint of creation itself. Each year, as the Nile's floodwaters receded, they left behind small mounds of fertile silt rising from the dark water, perfect mirrors of that first act of creation. The Egyptians understood that they lived not just in a land, but in a cosmic drama that repeated itself annually, connecting their daily lives to the fundamental forces that had shaped the universe. Long before the first pharaoh wore the double crown, before the first pyramid rose from the desert floor, small communities of farmers and herders had learned to read the river's moods with the precision of astronomers. They discovered that the annual flood arrived in harmony with the rising of Sirius, the dog star, just before dawn, proof that heaven and earth moved in perfect synchronization. These early settlements along the Nile were already sophisticated in ways that would define Egyptian civilization for millennia. They oriented their villages to catch the cooling north wind, built their homes from mud brick that would endure for generations, and developed agricultural techniques that could feed large populations in a land where rain was almost unknown. But it was in their treatment of the dead that these early Egyptians revealed their most distinctive insight into the nature of existence. Unlike other ancient peoples who simply buried their deceased, the inhabitants of the Nile Valley began the practice of deliberate preservation. They wrapped bodies in linen, placed them in wooden coffins, and surrounded them with provisions for a journey they believed would lead to eternal life. The tomb goods found in these pre-dynastic burials, pottery painted with images of boats, dancers and animals both real and mythical, reveal a people already convinced that death was not an ending but a transformation. The boat motifs are particularly telling, for they show that even before the great funeral barges of the pharaohs, Egyptians envisioned the afterlife as a journey across celestial waters. This early period, archaeologists tell us, saw the gradual coalescence of two distinct kingdoms. In the south, Upper Egypt stretched from the first cataract at Aswan to the region around modern-day Cairo, a narrow ribbon of green bordered by high cliffs that compressed the river into a swift, dramatic flow. Here, in cities like Hierakonpolis and Abydos, chieftains who wore the tall white crown of Upper Egypt ruled over communities that remained closely tied to ancient traditions. In the north, Lower Egypt spread across the broad delta, where the Nile divided into multiple branches before reaching the Mediterranean. This was a more cosmopolitan region, open to influences from across the sea, where rulers donned the red crown and governed from cities that served as gateways to the wider world. For centuries, These two kingdoms existed in a complex relationship of trade, rivalry, and occasional warfare. The archaeological record shows evidence of both peaceful exchange and violent conflict, as ideas, goods, and armies moved up and down the river that served as Egypt's central highway. The art of this pre-dynastic period reveals a society already obsessed with order, hierarchy, and the proper relationship between earthly and divine authority. Ceremonial palettes, carved knife handles, and decorated pottery show processions of animals, lines of captives, and rulers performing rituals that would remain virtually unchanged for 3,000 years. One of the most significant of these artifacts is the Hierakonpolis painted tomb, whose walls bear some of the earliest large-scale narrative art in human history. The scenes show boats with high prows carrying figures that may represent gods or deified ancestors, warriors in combat, and animals both domestic and wild arranged in patterns that suggest cosmic significance. The boats depicted in this tomb are particularly important, for they establish a visual language that would persist throughout Egyptian history. These vessels are not merely transportation, but cosmic vehicles, carrying their passengers across the waters that separate the world of the living from the realm of the dead. The tradition of the solar bark, the boat in which the sun god Ra travels across the sky each day, has its roots in these earliest artistic expressions. Religious beliefs during this formative period were already sophisticated, incorporating elements that would become central to later Egyptian theology. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, truth, and justice, appears to have emerged from the practical necessity of maintaining harmony in communities that depended entirely on the river's reliable annual cycle. The gods of this early pantheon were often associated with animals whose behavior provided insights into the natural world. The ibis, whose appearance heralded the flood, became associated with Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. The falcon, soaring high above the valley, was linked to Horus, the sky god who would become the divine prototype of pharaonic power. The cow, whose milk sustained life, was connected to Hathor, goddess of love, music, and maternal protection. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the emergence of what Egyptologists call the divine kingship ideology, the belief that earthly rulers were not merely chosen by the gods but were themselves divine beings, whose proper function was to maintain the cosmic order through ritual action and just governance. This concept would prove revolutionary in human political development. Previous societies had certainly claimed divine approval for their rulers, but the Egyptians went further, asserting that the king was literally a god incarnate, responsible not just for governing his people, but for ensuring that the sun rose each morning, the Nile flooded each year, and the forces of chaos did not overwhelm the ordered universe. The practical implications of this ideology were enormous. If the king was divine, then opposition to royal authority was not merely political rebellion, but cosmic sacrilege. If the king's ritual performance was essential to universal order, then the resources of the entire kingdom could legitimately be devoted to ensuring that these rituals were performed with perfect precision and magnificent splendor. Trade networks during this pre-dynastic period already extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, and gold from Nubia found their way into elite burials, indicating that Egypt was connected to long-distance exchange systems that would only grow more extensive as political unification provided the stability necessary for large-scale commercial ventures. The development of hieroglyphic writing, one of humanity's earliest writing systems, appears to have begun during this period as well. The earliest hieroglyphs are found on labels attached to grave goods, indicating that writing emerged from the practical need to identify and catalogue the provisions placed in tombs for the deceased's use in the afterlife. These early hieroglyphs were primarily pictographic. A bird represented a bird, a house represented a house, but they quickly evolved to include phonetic elements, allowing scribes to record not just objects, but sounds, names, and eventually abstract concepts. The sophistication of this system would eventually rival that of any writing system ever devised, capable of expressing everything from grocery lists to profound theological speculation. As the 4th millennium BCE drew to a close, the stage was set for the political unification that would transform Egypt from a collection of competing chiefdoms into one of history's most enduring civilizations. The archaeological evidence suggests that this unification was achieved through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic marriage, and religious innovation that presented the victorious rulers as divinely ordained to govern both lands. The catalyst for this transformation was a ruler whose name echoes through history like thunder across water, Narmer, known to later Greek historians as Mummies, the unifier. Around 3100 BCE, this southern king launched a campaign that would not merely conquer territory, but would establish the template for divine kingship that would endure for over 3 millennia. The Narmer Palette, one of the most important historical documents from the ancient world, commemorates this unification in imagery that is both political propaganda and religious art. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt as he strikes down a northern enemy. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt as he inspects the decapitated corpses of his foes. But the palette is more than a record of military victory. It establishes the iconographic language of pharaonic power that would remain virtually unchanged for 3,000 years. The king is shown as larger than life, literally towering over his enemies and supporters alike. He is attended by the gods, protected by divine symbols, and invested with the regalia that marks him as the earthly representative of cosmic order. The unification achieved by Narmer was not merely political, but cosmological. By joining the two lands under a single crown, he created something unprecedented in human history. A kingdom that embodied the harmony of opposites, the reconciliation of competing forces that was essential to maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order upon which all existence depended. Memphis, the capital city founded at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, became the physical manifestation of this unified vision. Located where the river valley met the delta, where the narrow ribbon of Upper Egypt opened into the broad expanse of Lower Egypt, Memphis stood as a symbol of the king's role as the one who brought together what had been separate, who created unity from diversity, order from chaos. The establishment of Memphis as the capital was a stroke of political genius that would influence urban planning for millennia. By building his new city at the geographical center of his unified kingdom, Narmer ensured that royal authority would be equally accessible to both north and south. The city became the hub of a transportation network that connected every corner of Egypt to the royal presence. But Memphis was more than an administrative center. It was a sacred city where the king performed the rituals essential to cosmic order. The great temple of Ptah, the creator god who was said to have spoken the world into existence, became the religious heart of the kingdom, where daily ceremonies ensured the continuation of divine favor and the proper functioning of the universe. The early dynasties that followed Narmer's unification, the first and second dynasties, spanning roughly from 3100 to 2686 BCE, devoted themselves to elaborating and institutionalizing the system of divine kingship that he had established. These rulers were not content to be merely successful warlords. They sought to transform themselves into cosmic principles, eternal guardians of the order that separated civilization from chaos. The royal tombs of this period, excavated at Abydos and Saqqara, reveal the enormous resources devoted to ensuring the king's successful transition from earthly ruler to divine ancestor. These mastaba tombs, rectangular structures with sloping sides and flat tops, were filled with everything the deceased king would need in the afterlife: food, furniture, weapons, jewelry, and even servants who were sometimes buried alive to accompany their master into eternity. The practice of human sacrifice at royal funerals, while shocking to modern sensibilities, reflected the logical extension of divine kingship ideology. If the king was truly divine, if his continued existence in the afterlife was essential to cosmic order, then no sacrifice was too great to ensure his proper transition to the next world. The servants who died with their king were not victims, but participants in a cosmic drama that would benefit all of creation. The administrative system that developed during these early dynasties would become legendary for its efficiency and comprehensiveness. Scribes trained in hieroglyphic writing formed the backbone of a bureaucracy that recorded everything: the height of the annual flood, the contents of royal storehouses, the names and duties of officials, the tribute received from foreign lands. This was perhaps the world's first truly literate civilization, where written records were not merely aids to memory, but instruments of power. The ability to read and write hieroglyphs was a closely guarded privilege that marked its possessors as members of an educated elite with access to the accumulated wisdom of ages. The hieroglyphic system itself evolved rapidly during this period, developing from simple pictographs into a sophisticated writing system capable of expressing abstract concepts, recording spoken language, and preserving complex theological speculation. The scribes who mastered this system were not mere clerks, but intellectuals whose skills were essential to the functioning of the state. Religious development during the early dynastic period laid the foundation for beliefs that would remain central to Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia. The concept of the pharaoh as Horus, the falcon god who ruled the living, and as Osiris, the god who ruled the dead, established the dual nature of kingship that would define royal ideology throughout Egyptian history. The myth of Osiris, which would become central to Egyptian beliefs about death and resurrection, appears to have emerged during this period as a way of explaining and justifying the king's transition from earthly ruler to divine ancestor. According to this myth, Osiris was a benevolent king who was murdered by his jealous brother Seth, dismembered and scattered across Egypt. His wife Isis gathered the pieces and restored him to life, but Osiris chose to rule the underworld rather than return to earth, becoming the judge of the dead and the guarantor of eternal life for the righteous. This story provided a powerful model for understanding royal death, not as ending, but as transformation, not as defeat, but as assumption of an even more important cosmic role. Every pharaoh who died became Osiris, joining the company of divine ancestors who continued to protect and guide Egypt from the afterlife. The artistic achievements of the early dynastic period established conventions that would remain virtually unchanged for 3,000 years. Egyptian art was not intended to capture fleeting moments or individual personality, but to create eternal images that would ensure the continued existence of their subjects in the afterlife. The formal, hieratic style that characterized Egyptian sculpture and painting, figures standing in eternal poses, men with left foot forward, women with feet together, both facing forward while their heads turned in profile, was not primitive technique, but sophisticated theology made visible. This art aimed to transcend time, to create images that would be as meaningful and powerful in the afterlife as they were in the world of the living. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2686 BCE, Egypt had become recognizably itself. A unified kingdom stretching from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean, ruled by divine pharaohs, sustained by the annual gift of the Nile flood, organized by an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy, and protected by the cosmic order of Maat. But human ambition, once awakened, knows no bounds. The pharaohs who inherited this carefully ordered world would soon discover that stone and geometry, properly combined, could touch the imperishable stars themselves. The stage was set for the Old Kingdom, the age of pyramid builders, when Egypt would create monuments so magnificent that they would be counted among the wonders of the world for all time. The Great Pyramid Complex at Giza stands today as humanity's most enduring achievement, but its story begins not with grand ambition, but with a single revolutionary idea. Around 2670 BCE, a third dynasty pharaoh named Djoser faced the same challenge that had confronted every ruler before him: how to ensure his successful journey to the afterlife while demonstrating his divine authority to the living. The answer came from his architect, a man whose genius would echo through eternity. Imhotep, physician, astronomer, sage, and master builder, stood before his pharaoh with plans that defied every convention of royal burial. No longer would the divine ruler rest beneath a simple mastaba tomb. Instead, he would ascend to heaven on a stairway of stone. At Saqqara, across the Nile from Memphis, Imhotep began construction of something unprecedented: a stepped pyramid rising in 6 massive tiers toward the sky. Each level represented progress closer to the divine realm, a physical manifestation of the celestial ladder that would carry the deceased pharaoh to join Ra in his solar bark. The step pyramid complex was more than a tomb. It was a miniature cosmos rendered in limestone. Courtyards for the eternal celebration of the Sed festival, chambers filled with provisions for the afterlife, false doors through which the pharaoh's spirit could pass between worlds. For the first time in human history, someone had attempted to construct eternity itself. But Imhotep's masterpiece was only the beginning. His innovation unleashed an architectural fever that would consume the Fourth Dynasty and create wonders that still inspire awe 4.5 millennia later. The challenge had been set. Each new pharaoh must reach higher, build grander, achieve greater perfection than his predecessor. Sneferu, first pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, inherited this ambition and made it his obsession. He embarked on a construction program so vast it defies comprehension. Not one pyramid, but 3, each a stepping stone toward architectural perfection. At Maidum, he completed a stepped pyramid begun by his predecessor, then transformed it into the first true pyramid by filling in the steps with smooth limestone casing. But the angles were wrong, the weight distribution flawed. Parts of the structure collapsed, earning it the modern name, the collapsed pyramid. Undeterred, Sneferu moved north to Dashur and began again. His second attempt rose at a sharp angle of 54 degrees, but halfway up, the builders realized their mistake. The angle was too steep. The structure would collapse under its own weight. They changed course mid-construction, reducing the angle to 43 degrees, creating the distinctive bent profile that gives the bent pyramid its name. Still not satisfied, Sneferu commissioned a third pyramid at Dashur, the Red Pyramid, named for the reddish limestone of its core. Here, finally, the builders achieved perfection. The angle was ideal, the construction flawless. The first true pyramid stood complete, its smooth sides catching the desert sun like a geometric mountain crafted by the gods themselves. Sneferu's son inherited not just a throne, but a challenge that seemed impossible to surpass. How could any structure exceed the magnificence of his father's achievements? Khufu's answer would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At Giza, on a plateau overlooking Memphis, Khufu's architects laid out plans for a pyramid that would dwarf all others. For over 20 years, perhaps 30,000 workers labored to create the Great Pyramid. Massive limestone blocks, each weighing as much as 15 tons, were quarried from the Giza plateau itself. The finest white limestone came from Tura across the Nile, ferried by barges during the annual flood. Granite for the inner chambers travelled 600 miles down the Nile from Aswan, massive blocks that required specially constructed vessels to transport. The precision of the Great Pyramid borders on the supernatural. Its base covers 13 acres and is level to within just 2 centimeters. The 4 sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, deviating by only 3 arc minutes. The pyramid's height, originally 481 feet, relates to its base by the mathematical constant pi, though whether this was intentional or coincidental remains one of Egyptology's enduring mysteries. Inside, the architects created a complex of chambers and passageways that speaks to both practical needs and cosmic symbolism. The descending passage plunges into the bedrock toward an unfinished subterranean chamber, perhaps the original burial site abandoned when plans changed. The ascending passage leads to the Grand Gallery, a soaring corridor with a corbelled ceiling that ranks among the masterpieces of ancient architecture. At its end lies the King's Chamber, constructed entirely of red granite and housing a massive sarcophagus that was placed there during construction, too large to fit through the passages once the pyramid was complete. The Great Pyramid was not merely Khufu's tomb, but the centerpiece of an entire necropolis. The complex included a mortuary temple, where daily offerings would be made to the deceased pharaoh's spirit, a causeway connecting the pyramid to a valley temple, where the mummification rituals were performed, and smaller pyramids for Khufu's queens. Surrounding the main pyramid, hundreds of mastaba tombs housed the nobles and officials who would serve their pharaoh in the afterlife, creating an eternal city of the dead. But even Khufu's achievement could not satisfy the architectural ambitions of the 4th dynasty. His son Khafra constructed the 2nd pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller than his father's but appearing taller because it stands on higher ground. Khafra also commissioned the Great Sphinx, carved from a massive outcrop of limestone left by his father's quarrying operations. With the body of a lion and the head of a pharaoh, the Sphinx embodies the concept of divine kingship, the wisdom of humanity combined with the strength of the mightiest predator. Menkaure, Khafra's successor, completed the Giza trilogy with a 3rd pyramid, smaller than its companions, but no less carefully constructed. By now, the enormous expense of these projects was straining even the vast resources of the most powerful state on Earth. The royal pyramid remained massive, but the complex was simpler, the subsidiary buildings less elaborate. These pyramids were not constructed by slaves, despite popular imagination. Recent archaeological evidence from the workers' villages at Giza reveals that the labourers were well-fed craftsmen, probably conscripted during the flood season when farming was impossible. They consumed massive quantities of beef, bread and beer, a diet that speaks to their valued status rather than oppression. Graffiti left by work gangs bears proud names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting a sense of pride in their monumental achievement. The pyramid complexes functioned as economic engines that employed thousands of people year-round. Priests maintained daily rituals, offering food and incense to the deceased pharaoh's spirit. Craftsmen created the furniture, jewelry, and provisions needed for the afterlife. Farmers on royal estates provided the agricultural surplus that funded these activities. The pyramids were not testaments to royal vanity, but religious and economic institutions that sustained entire communities. During this golden age, divine kingship reached its apex. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but a cosmic principle, the living embodiment of Horus, who would become Osiris upon death. The pyramid texts, first carved in the burial chamber of Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty, preserve the religious beliefs that animated these monuments. They speak of the deceased pharaoh ascending to heaven, joining the imperishable stars, becoming one with Ra on his eternal journey across the sky. The nobles who surrounded these divine pharaohs constructed their own elaborate tombs, creating an art form that would influence civilization for millennia. The mastaba tombs at Saqqara and Giza are decorated with scenes of daily life rendered in exquisite detail. Farmers harvesting grain, fishermen casting nets, craftsmen at their benches, dancers and musicians entertaining guests at banquets. These images were not mere decoration, but magical insurance, ensuring that the deceased would enjoy these pleasures throughout eternity. Women enjoyed remarkable status during the Old Kingdom. Queen Pharaohs, Khufu's mother, was buried with furniture and jewellery of extraordinary craftsmanship. The goldwork found in her tomb demonstrates a level of artistic achievement that would not be surpassed for centuries. Other royal women, like Queen Khentkawe's, may have ruled in their own right during transitional periods between dynasties. The administrative system that supported this monumental age was a marvel of efficiency. The Abusir papyri, discovered in the pyramid complex of Neferefre, provide the earliest substantial administrative archives from ancient times. They reveal a bureaucracy of extraordinary sophistication, tracking everything from the daily rations of temple workers to the movements of ships carrying stone from distant quarries. Officials with titles like Overseer of all royal works and Chief Architect commanded resources that dwarfed those of most contemporary kingdoms. Science and mathematics flourished alongside architecture. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, though copied much later, preserves medical knowledge that likely dates to this period, the first systematic description of surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and rational medical thinking. The Rhine Papyrus demonstrates mathematical concepts, including the beginnings of geometry and algebra, that the pyramid builders must have mastered to achieve their architectural miracles. Trade networks expanded to support the construction programs. Cedar wood from Lebanon provided timber for boats and scaffolding. Gold from Nubia funded the vast expenses. Copper from Sinai was alloyed with tin to create bronze tools that made precise stone cutting possible. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan decorated royal jewellery, while incense from Punt perfumed temple rituals. Religious concepts crystallized during this period that would remain central to Egyptian belief for 3,000 years. The sun god Ra emerged as the supreme deity, the creator and sustainer of all life. The deceased pharaoh was thought to join Ra's crew on the solar bark, helping to fight off the serpent Apophis, who threatened to devour the sun each night. This daily cosmic drama was reflected in the orientation of temples and pyramids, aligned to catch the first rays of dawn. But even the mightiest kingdoms contain the seeds of their own decline. The enormous resources devoted to pyramid construction gradually weakened the central government. Provincial governors, grown wealthy from managing the royal estates, began to assert increasing independence. The ideology of divine kingship, taken to its logical extreme, paradoxically weakened royal power by making the pharaoh too sacred for effective political action. The Fifth Dynasty marked the beginning of this slow decline. The pyramids grew smaller, the construction less precise. Solar temples dedicated to Ra began to compete with royal tombs for resources and attention. The divine pharaoh was still revered, but power was slowly diffusing to the priesthood and provincial nobility. Pepi II, who ascended the throne as a child around 2278 BCE, would rule for 94 years, the longest reign in human history. But longevity proved a curse rather than a blessing. As the aged pharaoh became increasingly isolated in his palace, real power shifted to regional governors who ruled their provinces like independent kingdoms. The central government, weakened by decades of massive construction projects and lavish court life, could no longer enforce its authority over distant territories. Climate change compounded political weakness. The annual flood, the foundation of Egyptian prosperity, began to fail. Drought gripped the region, causing famine and social unrest. Provincial governors hoarded grain while the central government proved powerless to redistribute resources effectively. The unified realm that had stood for over 5 centuries began to fragment. As Pepi II's endless reign finally ended, The last vestiges of central authority crumbled with him. Provincial warlords declared independence. Memphis emptied as courtiers fled to their home districts, and the Great Pyramids stood silent, their daily rituals abandoned. The age of divine pharaohs was over. Chaos was about to be born. The collapse came not with fire and sword, but with the simple failure of water to rise. For 7 years in succession, the life-giving flood barely reached the banks of the Nile. Fields that had known fertility for millennia turned to dust. Granaries built to last through normal lean years emptied and stayed empty. The divine order that had sustained civilization for 8 centuries cracked like sun-baked clay. In the villages, people began to die. First the elderly, then the children. Finally, the strong young farmers who had always seemed as eternal as the pyramids themselves. The provincial governors, grown fat on the tribute that had once flowed to Memphis, hoarded what grain remained. Trade routes emptied as merchants found nothing to buy and no one able to pay. The bureaucrats who had recorded every basket of wheat and every jar of oil found themselves with nothing left to count. Memphis, the eternal capital, became a ghost city. The great palace where divine pharaohs had held court for centuries echoed with the footsteps of servants who would soon abandon their posts. The workshops that had created treasures for royal tombs fell silent. The priests who had maintained daily rituals in temple after temple found their altars bare of offerings. Even the gods, it seemed, had abandoned their chosen people. But nature's cruelty only revealed the deeper rot that had been spreading through the kingdom's foundations. The old kingdom had not merely collapsed, it had devoured itself. Decades of pyramid construction had drained the treasury, leaving no reserves for crisis. The ideology of divine kingship had grown so rigid that rulers could no longer adapt to changing circumstances. Most fatally, power had drained away from the centre to regional strongmen who owed their positions to royal favour but felt no loyalty to royal authority. When central government finally disappeared, these provincial governors simply declared themselves independent rulers. The unified realm shattered into dozens of petty kingdoms, each controlling a few districts along the Nile. They fought constant wars over irrigation rights, trade routes, and the dwindling resources of a land in crisis. Some called themselves pharaohs, commissioning crude pyramids and pathetic imitations of royal regalia. Others abandoned all pretense and ruled as simple warlords. The sacred order that had made civilization possible evaporated. Mat, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and harmony, seemed to have fled the world entirely. Ancient texts from this period preserve the horror of those who lived through civilization's collapse. The land spins around as does a potter's wheel. Towns are destroyed. Upper Egypt has become wasteland. Crocodiles gorge on the fish they have caught, and people go to them of their own accord. Even more shocking than political chaos was social revolution. The rigid hierarchies that had defined society for centuries dissolved overnight. Servants claimed their master's property, peasants wore fine linen, while nobles dressed in rags. The careful burial customs that had distinguished rich from poor disappeared, as surviving communities could barely afford to bury their dead at all, let alone with the elaborate provisions that had once guaranteed eternal comfort. Yet as we reach the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the mighty Aztec Empire, we are reminded that even the greatest civilizations are but chapters in humanity's ongoing story. The Aztecs, like the Egyptians and Incas before them, showed us the remarkable heights human ingenuity, organization, and spiritual devotion can achieve. Their floating gardens, magnificent temples, and complex society stand as testament to what is possible when people unite around a shared vision and purpose. Yet their ultimate fate teaches us that no empire, no matter how powerful or divinely inspired, can escape the inevitable forces of time and change. While empires may crumble, the human spirit's capacity for wonder, creativity, and resilience endures forever.